I arrived in late August, when the Montana summer was at its zenith. The air itself felt ancient and clean, scrubbed pure by the vast, indifferent wilderness. My property was situated in a narrow valley carved by glaciers millennia ago, a place of deep woods and high, treeless crest lines. The western region of the state is a dramatic landscape of tall mountains and thick forests, a world away from the rolling plains to the east. From my porch, I could see the distant, jagged line of the Continental Divide, the great stony spine of the continent that dictates whether a single raindrop will journey to the Pacific or the Atlantic. The sheer scale of it was humbling, a powerful geographic feature that made my meticulously planned life feel infinitesimal. My only companion was Kepler, a stoic German shepherd whose quiet presence was a comfort, not a compromise to my solitude. Together, we settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. The first few months were a kind of austere paradise, a validation of my every theory. The initial challenges of off-grid life were exactly that, challenges, not threats. They were puzzles to be solved, systems to be mastered. I learned the hum of the inverter as the solar panels soaked up the long hours of daylight. The precise amount of wood the stove required to keep the cabin at a steady temperature through the cool nights, and the satisfying ache in my muscles after a day spent chopping and stacking firewood. The silence I had craved was more profound than I could have imagined. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air that muffled the incessant chatter of my own mind. On warm afternoons, the air was thick with the sweet, resinous scent of ponderosa pines, a fragrance like butterscotch and vanilla that seemed to emanate from the very soul of the forest. This was my baseline, hard, honest, and real. I had established a perimeter of safety, both physical and psychological, and I felt, for the first time in years, truly at peace. The shift began subtly, a change in tone as gradual and inexorable as the turning of the earth, as August bled into September, and then October. The character of the wilderness began to change. The sun, arching lower in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe in the periphery of my vision. The vibrant greens of summer faded to the somber golds and browns of autumn. The days grew noticeably shorter, the darkness at either end of the day encroaching on the light like a closing aperture. The practicalities of my existence became more demanding. The solar array, once a source of effortless power, struggled to keep the battery bank charged during the increasingly overcast days. I became reliant on the propane generator, its mechanical drone a jarring intrusion into the sacred silence. The sound felt like a failure, a concession to the very world I had sought to escape. The cold developed a sharper edge, a predatory bite that seeped through the window seals and made the wood stove's hunger for fuel seem insatiable. These were the expected hardships, the documented struggles of homesteading in a formidable climate. I logged them in my notes with a kind of grim satisfaction. But there were other things that did not fit my rational framework. It began with a feeling, the oldest and most primal of fears, of being watched. I would be splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe, the only sound for miles, and suddenly the hair on my arms would stand on end. I would turn, scanning the dense wall of pine and fir that bordered the clearing, and see nothing but the sway of branches in the wind. Yet, the feeling persisted, a silent, unseen pressure at my back. Kepler felt it too. He would often stop mid-stride, his head cocked, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest as he stared into the impenetrable woods. The true turning point came on a moonless night in late October. The generator was off. I was conserving fuel. The cabin was plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt liquid, a tangible substance that pressed against the windows. The only light was the faint, flickering orange glow from the stove's air intake. Kepler was asleep at my feet. The silence was perfect, a complete absence of sound that I had once found so restorative. Now, it felt like a held breath. And then it was broken. It was a sound unlike any I had ever heard. It was not the howl of a wolf or the scream of a mountain lion, animals I knew inhabited these woods. This was something else entirely. It was a long, high-pitched cry that slid up the scale until it was almost a shriek, a sound of profound and terrible grief. But beneath the sorrow was a note of chilling mockery, of malevolence. It was a terrifying, almost feminine wail that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. At my feet, Kepler shot up, his body rigid, a furious, guttural snarl erupting from his throat as his hackles rose in a solid ridge along his spine. The sound came again, closer this time, and it ended in a series of sharp, barking yips that were utterly alien. My academic mind scrambled for an explanation. A fox, perhaps, or a wolf with a bizarre vocal abnormality. The wind could play strange tricks in the mountains, funneling through rock formations to create acoustic oddities. But my body knew better. This was not the wind. This was the sound of a predator. This was a voice that belonged to the deep, dark corners of the world, a place untouched by reason or time. The sound was a violation, an ancient and hungry thing that had no place in my well-ordered experiment. In the days that followed, the world shrank to the perimeter of my cabin. The feeling of being watched was no longer a fleeting sensation. It was a constant, oppressive certainty. I took to carrying my .30-06 rifle with me everywhere, even on the short walk to the woodpile, the cold metal a flimsy comfort against the vast, listening wilderness. My nights were sleepless, spent staring into the darkness beyond the windows, straining to hear anything over the frantic pounding of my own heart. The silence I had once cherished had become my tormentor, a blank canvas upon which my fear painted its most terrifying images. The first snow came a week later, a silent, heavy fall that blanketed the landscape in a shroud of pristine white. It fell for a full day and night, and when I opened my door the next morning, the world was transformed. The mountains, the trees, the very air seemed muffled and still. The oppressive sense of being watched had vanished, replaced by a clean, cold emptiness. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of my old confidence return. With Kepler trotting ahead, I began a circuit of the clearing, checking for any damage from the weight of the snow. It was as we rounded the northern edge of the property, near the thickest part of the forest, that Kepler stopped dead. He let out a low whine, his tail tucked between his legs. The air, which had smelled of nothing but cold and pine, now carried a faint, coppery tang. And then I saw it. Sprawled in a crimson crater against the white snow was the carcass of a large mule deer, or what was left of it. I was no stranger to the realities of nature. I had seen kills before. But this was different. This was not the work of a clean predator. The animal had been savaged, its ribcage torn open with incredible force, its entrails strewn across the snow in a grotesque tableau. The neck was snapped at an impossible angle, and the flesh of its haunches was ripped away, not neatly eaten, but shredded, as if by something with immense, crushing jaw strength. It was an act of pure, frenzied violence. My eyes darted around, searching for the tracks of a wolf pack or a mountain lion. But there were none. There was only one set of tracks, leading from the dark tree line to the mangled deer, and then away again. My breath caught in my chest. They were Cain, yes, but wrong. The prints were too large, the gait too strange. They were staggered, with the rear prints falling slightly inside the front, suggesting a sloping back and a loping, hyena-like stride. A single creature had done this. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slowly raised my eyes, following the path of those monstrous tracks as they led away from the carnage. They cut a clear, deliberate line through the undisturbed snow. A line that led directly toward the dark, silent shape of my cabin. The tracks leading to my cabin were in declaration of war. The wilderness, which I had seen as a neutral force, a grand and indifferent system, had revealed itself to be something else entirely. It had a will, and that will was malevolent. My carefully constructed world of reason and self-sufficiency collapsed into a single, primal point of terror. I was being hunted. My cabin, once a symbol of my independence, became my fortress and my prison. The vast, snow-covered landscape, which had seemed so pure and cleansing just that morning, now felt like a cage. Every direction I looked, there was only an endless expanse of white, a blank page on which my death could be written at any moment. The isolation I had so deliberately sought was now my greatest enemy. My mind, starved of any other human contact, began to turn on itself. Paranoia took root in the fertile soil of my solitude. Every creak of the cabin settling under the weight of the snow, every gust of wind that moaned through the pines was the sound of the creature's approach. I would sit for hours, my rifle across my lap, staring out the window until the trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to shift and coalesce into monstrous forms. Kepler was my only anchor to reality. He rarely left my side, his warm, solid presence a constant reassurance that I was not yet completely alone. But he was on edge too. A deep, anxious whine was a constant rumble in his chest, and he would spend long periods standing at the door, his nose pressed to the crack, sniffing the frigid air for a scent I could not detect. The first night after finding the deer was the longest of my life. I barricaded the door with a heavy oak table and kept the generator running, flooding the clearing with the harsh, artificial light of the exterior flood lamps. The noise and the light felt like a flimsy shield against the immense, patient darkness that surrounded us. I did not sleep. I sat in my chair, watching, listening. Just after midnight, the generator sputtered and died. I had forgotten to refuel it, a stupid, amateur mistake born of panic. The floodlights cut out, plunging the world outside into an impenetrable blackness. The sudden silence was deafening, and in that silence, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic crunching sound. Footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate. They were circling the cabin. Kepler stood bolt upright, the fur on his back bristling as a low, menacing growl escaped his lips. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. I held my breath, my knuckles white on the stock of my rifle. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then came a new sound, a wet, snuffling noise, as something inhaled deeply at the base of the door, testing my scent. It was followed by a low, guttural shuff, a sound of curiosity and hunger. Then a single, powerful scratch of claws dragged down the thick wood of the door. I flinched as if I had been struck. Kepler erupted into a frenzy of barking, throwing himself against the door, his rage a stark contrast to the cold terror that had seized me. Outside, there was no response. Just the sound of those heavy footsteps resuming their circuit, a predator patiently inspecting the walls of its trap. They continued for what felt like an eternity before finally fading back into the vast, silent wilderness. The days that followed fell into a nightmarish routine. By day, I was a prisoner, venturing out only for the most essential tasks, my rifle always in hand. The world felt alien, the familiar landscape tainted by the constant, oppressive fear. At night, it returned. It never tried to force its way in, not yet. It was a campaign of psychological warfare. It would circle, scratch at the walls, and sometimes it would make a sound. Not the terrifying, wailing cry I had heard before, but a series of low, throaty clicks and strange, barking yips that sounded disturbingly intelligent, like a form of communication I was not meant to understand. My grip on reality began to fray. Sleep deprivation and unrelenting stress were eroding my rational mind. I started having auditory hallucinations, hearing the creature's high, pitched wail carried on the wind, even during the bright, empty hours of the day. I began to question everything. Was the creature real, or was I succumbing to a form of psychosis brought on by the profound isolation? Was this a monster of the wilderness, or a monster born from the dark, unexplored corners of my own mind? I started a journal, a frantic, desperate attempt to document what was happening, to prove to myself that I was not insane. The blizzard hit on the 5th day. It came without warning, a solid wall of white that descended upon the valley, erasing the world. The wind howled like a banshee, driving the snow with such force that it felt like the cabin itself might be torn from its foundations. Visibility dropped to 0. I was no longer just isolated, I was entombed. The storm raged for 2 days. On the 2nd night, the propane for the generator finally ran out. The cabin was plunged into a near total darkness, the only light a faint, demonic glow from the air vents of the wood stove. The roar of the wind was my only companion, a constant, chaotic symphony that masked any other sound. It was in a brief lull in the storm, a moment of eerie silence, that I saw it. I was adding a log to the stove when a flicker of movement at the main window caught my eye. I turned slowly, my heart seizing in my chest. Pressed against the glass, peering in, was a face. It was there for only a second, illuminated by the faint orange light of the fire, but the image was burned into my mind. It was canine, but horribly wrong. The fur was matted and black, the snout elongated and narrow. But the eyes were not those of an animal. They were intelligent, calculating, and filled with a cold, ancient malice. They were a pale, luminous yellow, and they stared directly at me. I cried out, stumbling backward and dropping the log. The face vanished. I scrambled for my rifle, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and pointed it at the empty, black square of the window. But there was nothing there but the swirling snow and the reflection of my own terrified face. The storm broke the next morning, leaving behind a world of impossible, pristine beauty. The snow was piled in massive drifts, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was still and cold, the silence absolute. For a moment, it felt as if the last week had been nothing more than a fever dream. But Kepler knew better. He was frantic, pacing between the door and the broken window, which I had boarded up with planks from a crate. He whined and pawed at the door, desperate to get out. I knew it was a terrible idea, but the silence was unnerving, and I needed to know if it was gone. With my rifle in hand, I unbarred the door and stepped out into the blinding light. The snow was deep, reaching my thighs. Kepler bounded out ahead of me, his nose to the ground, immediately picking up a scent. I followed him, my eyes scanning the tree line. The tracks were there, of course. The same monstrous, loping prints, circling the cabin. But this time, there was something else. A wide, dragged path in the snow, leading from the front of the cabin toward the woodpile. It looked as if something heavy had been pulled away. My blood ran cold. I looked at the woodpile, and then back at the cabin. The heavy canvas tarp I used to cover the spare propane tanks was gone. And then I heard it, not from the woods, but from inside my own cabin. A single, sharp crash of breaking glass, followed by the sound of Kepler's furious, terrified barking. I turned and ran, floundering through the deep snow. It was a trap. It had lured me out. I reached the door, my lungs burning, and shoved it open. The cabin was in chaos. The table I had used as a barricade was overturned. The window on the far side of the room, the one I hadn't boarded up, was shattered, shards of glass glittering on the floor. Kepler was backed into a corner, snarling and snapping at the empty space where the window had been. And on the floor, just below the broken pane, was a single, dark object. It was a large, splintered piece of bone, still slick with blood and scraps of flesh. It was a rib, from the deer. It had left me a gift, a promise. It wasn't just hunting me anymore. It was playing with me, and it was telling me, in no uncertain terms, that it could get inside whenever it wanted. The splintered rib on my floor was not just a threat, it was a message. It was a declaration that the flimsy wooden walls of my cabin were no longer a barrier. The sanctity of my home had been violated, and the psychological line I had drawn between inside and outside, between safety and danger, had been erased. The creature was not just a predator testing the strength of its prey's enclosure. It was an intelligent, calculating entity that understood terror. It was teaching me that there was no escape, that it could reach me whenever it chose. My world contracted to the four walls of the cabin, and my mind, a prisoner within that small space, began to collapse. The days were a blur of hypervigilance, the nights an eternity of sleepless dread. I nailed boards over the shattered window, but it was a futile gesture. Every shadow that danced in the firelight was the creature. Every gust of wind that rattled the eaves was its claws scrabbling for a purchase. My carefully rationed supplies dwindled, but the thought of venturing outside for more firewood was paralyzing. I began to burn my books, my furniture, anything that would feed the stove and keep the encroaching, predatory cold at bay. The isolation, once my chosen companion, was now a malevolent force hollowing me out from the inside. My thoughts grew disordered, looping back on themselves in a spiral of fear and paranoia. I started talking to myself, my voice a strange, hoarse whisper in the suffocating silence. I would argue with an imagined version of my former self, the confident academic who had walked into this valley so full of certainty. He would mock my terror, and I would scream at him, telling him of the yellow eyes and the tracks in the snow. Kepler would watch me, his head cocked, a low whine of confusion and distress in his throat. The hallucinations began on the third day after the break-in. At first, they were auditory, the high, wailing cry echoing from the distant peaks, even when the sun was high in the sky. Then they became visual. I would catch fleeting glimpses of a dark, loping shape at the edge of the clearing, only to have it dissolve into the familiar shape of a stump or a shadow when I looked directly at it. The line between the real and the imagined was dissolving, and I feared I was losing my mind, that the creature was not a physical entity, but a manifestation of my own psychological collapse. But then I would look at Kepler, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the tree line, and I knew the monster was real. The realization that I had to leave came with the sudden, chilling clarity of a man on the gallows. To stay was to die. It was no longer a question of if, but when. My grand experiment in self-sufficiency had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The goal was no longer to prove a philosophical point. It was simply to survive. My truck, my only link to the outside world, was parked 50 yards from the cabin. 50 yards of open, snow-covered ground that had become a killing field. I spent a full day watching from the window, trying to discern a pattern in the creature's movements, a window of opportunity. But there was none. It was always out there, a patient, unseen presence in the woods. I knew I would have to make a run for it. I waited for the false dawn, that gray, liminal hour when the darkness begins to recede, but the sun has not yet risen. I gathered what I could: my rifle, a box of shells, the truck keys, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. I took a long pull from the bottle, the burn in my throat a welcome, grounding sensation. I looked at Kepler, his loyal, trusting eyes fixed on me. "You stay here," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You make a sound, you draw it to me. You stay." He whined, pressing his head against my leg, not understanding. Leaving him was the hardest thing I had ever done, but I knew his barking would be my death sentence. I took a deep breath, unbarred the door, and stepped out into the biting, pre-dawn cold. The air was utterly still, the silence so profound it rang in my ears. The snow crunched loudly under my boots, each step a gunshot in the stillness. I moved slowly, deliberately, my rifle held at the ready, my eyes scanning the dark wall of trees. Halfway to the truck, the cabin was a dark shape behind me, the truck a promise of salvation ahead. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent world. I dared to hope, and then it came. It emerged from the trees to my right, not with a roar, but with a terrifying, silent speed. It was a nightmare of fluid motion, a creature of shadow and bone. It was larger than any wolf, its shoulders high and powerful, its back sloping down to its hindquarters in a way that was profoundly unnatural. Its fur was the color of dried blood at night, and its head was too large for its body, a grotesque parody of a canine skull. But it was the eyes that held me, the same luminous, intelligent yellow eyes I had seen through the window, burning with a cold, ancient hatred. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking, and fired. The shot was deafening in the silence, the recoil jarring my shoulder. I saw the snow kick up just to the left of its head. It didn't even flinch. It just lowered its head and charged. There was no time to aim again. I turned and ran, my legs pumping, my lungs screaming for air. The truck was so close. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers numb with cold and terror. The creature was on me. I felt a searing pain in my left shoulder as its claws tore through my jacket and into my flesh. I screamed, stumbling against the side of the truck, dropping the keys in the snow. Suddenly, a blur of fur and fury shot past me. Kepler. He had disobeyed. He launched himself at the creature, a snarling, 70-pound projectile of pure loyalty. The creature, surprised, swatted him away with a casual, brutal swipe of its massive paw. Kepler yelped, a sound of sharp, terrible pain, and was thrown against the side of the truck before falling limp in the snow. A wave of pure, white, hot rage washed over me, momentarily eclipsing my fear. I found the keys, my fingers closing around the cold metal. I scrambled into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine groaned, turned over once, and then fell silent. The creature's face appeared in the driver's side window, its yellow eyes staring into mine. It opened its mouth, and for the first time, I heard its voice up close. It was not a growl, but a sound that would haunt my dreams forever. A high, keening wail that sounded horribly, impossibly human. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated mockery. I turned the key again, praying to a god I had long since abandoned. The engine caught, roaring to life. The creature lunged, its jaws snapping shut, just inches from the glass as I slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The tires spun, caught, and the truck shot forward, leaving the creature and the still form of my dog behind. I did not look back. I drove with a reckless, desperate speed, the truck fishtailing on the icy road. I did not stop until the sun was high in the sky, and the mountains were a distant, jagged line in my rearview mirror. I am writing this from a motel room 1,000 miles away. The wound in my shoulder is deep, but it is nothing compared to the wounds in my mind. I have not slept in days. Every time I close my eyes, I see those yellow eyes. I hear that terrible, wailing cry. I came to Montana to find a purer, more rational way of life. I believed that the wilderness was a system to be understood, a challenge to be mastered. I was wrong. The wilderness is not indifferent. It is ancient, it is patient, and it is hungry. There are things in the deep, dark corners of the world that defy reason, things that have been there long before us and will be there long after we are gone. I went looking for solitude, and I found a monster. And I know, with a certainty that is colder and harder than any mountain peak, that it is still out there, in the silence and the snow, waiting. The motel room was a purgatory of beige and brown, 1,000 miles and a lifetime away from the snow-choked valley in Montana. The air, thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and stale cigarette smoke, was a constant, cloying reminder that I was back in a world I had tried to leave behind. But safety was an illusion. The four walls of this anonymous room felt just as fragile as the log walls of my cabin. I had escaped the wilderness, but I had brought the heart of its darkness with me. Sleep offered no refuge. It was a landscape of recurring nightmares, the crunch of monstrous paws in pristine snow, the glint of luminous yellow eyes in the firelight, the final, terrible yelp of my dog. I would wake up thrashing in sweat-soaked sheets, my own scream caught in my throat, the phantom pain in my shoulder, a burning echo of the creature's claws. During the day, I was a ghost, haunted by a hypervigilance that saw threats in every shadow. The rumble of a passing truck was the creature's growl. The scratching of a tree branch against the window was its claws on my door. My mind had become a prison, and the bars were forged from my own terror. Was I going insane? The question gnawed at me. Prolonged isolation, I knew from my academic background, could fracture the human psyche, breeding paranoia and hallucinations from the fertile soil of loneliness. Had I manufactured the monster from the depths of my own solitude? Was it a product of a mind under siege, a waking nightmare born of stress and fear? I clung to the memory of Kepler's last moments. His rage, his terror. His fear had been real. The mangled deer had been real. The wound on my shoulder, a series of deep, ragged gouges that the urgent care doctor had stitched up with a look of grim disbelief, was undeniably real. The monster was real. And if it was real, it had to have a name. Driven by a desperate need for validation, for an anchor in the storm of my own mind, I turned to the one tool I had left: research. I sat for hours in the dim light of the motel room, my laptop a portal back into the world of folklore and forgotten history. I started with simple, frantic searches. Montana monster wolf, hyena-like creature, animal with human scream. The results were a cascade of local ghost stories and Bigfoot sightings, but buried deep in a forum on cryptozoology, I found it, a name, Shunkawarakan. The name was from the Iowa people, and it translated to carries off dogs. My blood ran cold. I read it on, my hands shaking. The descriptions were chillingly familiar. It was a creature from folklore, a beast that resembled a wolf, but had the high shoulders and sloping back of a hyena. It was covered in dark, almost black fur, and was known for its terrifying, human-like cries. It was a nocturnal predator that would sneak into camps to steal dogs, a vicious and elusive killer that left behind only mangled carcasses and a legacy of fear. Then I found the story of Israel Ammon Hutchins. In 1886, in the Madison River Valley, not so far from where I had bought my land, Hutchins had shot and killed a strange creature that had been terrorizing local livestock. He had heard its long, keening, almost feminine, wail in the night. The animal he killed was so bizarre that a local taxidermist acquired it, naming it the ringdocus. For decades, the mounted creature was displayed in a small museum, a physical testament to the legend. I stared at the grainy, black, and white photograph of the ringdocus. The creature was frozen in a perpetual snarl, its taxidermied form a crude effigy of the fluid, living nightmare I had faced. But it was the same. The powerful shoulders, the sloping back, the unnaturally large head. It was him. The relief I felt was swiftly consumed by a new, more profound terror. I was not mad. But the thing that had hunted me was not just a random, freakish animal. It was a legend. A creature with a history, a name, a pattern of behavior that stretched back through generations. It was a permanent fixture of that landscape, an ancient and malevolent spirit of the wilderness. My research became an obsession, a descent into the dark folklore of the American frontier. I read about other cryptids, about tales of wendigos and skinwalkers, about places where the veil between worlds was thin. I read about the psychological toll of the homesteading era, of the isolation and hardship that drove people to madness, blurring the line between real and imagined horrors. But the more I read, the more one fact became clear. These stories were always tied to a place. The monsters belonged to the deep woods, the high plains, the lonely stretches of road. They were spirits of the land, and I had left the land behind. A fragile sense of hope began to take root. I was 1,000 miles away. I was safe. The creature was a territorial predator, its hunting ground the valley I had fled. Here, in this sterile, civilized world of asphalt and electricity, it had no power. The nightmares would fade. The paranoia would recede. I could heal. That evening, I stepped outside for the first time in days. The air was humid and heavy with the smell of exhaust, fumes, and rain-soaked pavement. I walked to a nearby diner, the fluorescent lights, and the low murmur of conversation a comforting balm. I ate a greasy meal, surrounded by people, and for the first time since I had fled Montana, I felt a flicker of something like peace. I walked back to the motel as a light rain began to fall. The parking lot was slick and black, reflecting the neon glow of the vacancy sign. I fumbled for my key card, my mind blessedly quiet. As I inserted the card into the lock, a smell hit me. It was faint, carried on the damp night air, but it was unmistakable. The sweet, resinous scent of ponderosa pines. I froze, my heart seizing in my chest. It was impossible. A hallucination, a trick of my traumatized mind. I told myself it was just a car air freshener, a cleaning product. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed the door open. The room was as I had left it, dark, quiet, empty. I locked the door, bolting it, my newfound peace shattering into a million pieces. I stood with my back against the door, my ears straining against the silence. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I slowly crossed the room to the window and peered through a gap in the cheap curtains. The parking lot was empty except for my truck and a few other cars, their surfaces gleaming under the security lights. There was nothing there, just the rain, the neon, the mundane reality of the civilized world. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. It was just my mind. It was PTSD. It would pass. I turned from the window, and my reflection moved with me in the dark glass of the television screen. But it wasn't just my reflection. For a fraction of a second that stretched into an eternity, another shape was there, standing behind me in the dark room. A tall, hulking silhouette with high, powerful shoulders and a grotesquely large head, and two luminous, pale yellow eyes burning with a cold, familiar, and utterly inescapable malice. My name is Jonathan Mercer, and I have spent most of my adult life investigating the strange and the inexplicable. People often call me a paranormal investigator, though that title has been warped by television shows and cheap internet videos. For me, it is not entertainment. It is study, documentation, and survival. I have walked through places where the air grows colder than death, where shadows stretch against the laws of light, and where voices emerge from empty corridors to whisper things I should not know. I have seen enough to understand that the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond it is not only thin, but fragile. And when it tears, something always slips through. That understanding is what brought me to Harrington House, an aging mansion crouched on a hill at the edge of Blackwood County. The mansion has stood for nearly 2 centuries, its foundations sunk into the bedrock of a forest that locals avoid even in daylight. The house itself is a legend whispered in taverns and coffee shops across the region, a place mothers mention to frighten their children into obedience. It is said that no one who has spent a full night within its walls has ever been the same afterward. Some returned mute, unable to describe what they saw. Others vanished altogether, as if the house itself consumed them. I was not invited here on a dare or lured by curiosity. I was hired. The estate had recently fallen into the hands of distant relatives of the Harrington bloodline, and with it came the responsibility to settle what to do with the property. They were business people, uninterested in old ghost stories, but keenly aware of the lawsuits that might follow if something unexplainable befell future owners. They contacted me with instructions that were almost laughably simple: spend 1 month in the mansion, document everything, and verify whether the stories had any foundation in reality. If the place was safe, it would be sold. If not, they would have it demolished. Before stepping foot in Harrington House, I was given something far more unsettling than a contract. I was handed a list. It was yellowed, the paper frayed along the edges as though it had been folded and unfolded countless times. Written in spidery ink across the page was a set of rules. There were 12 of them, each brief and absolute. The handwriting was not modern, it belonged to another century. 1. Never enter the East Wing after midnight. 2. Do not touch the mirrors on the 2nd floor. 3. If you hear a woman singing, do not seek the source. 4. Never accept an invitation to dine, no matter how it is delivered. 5. Keep every door closed behind you, especially at night. 6. Do not look directly at the portrait in the main hall after dusk. 7. If the fireplace lights on its own, leave the room immediately. 8. Should you find a child wandering the halls, do not speak to it. 9. Cover all clocks before sleeping. 10. Never follow the sound of footsteps, even if they are your own. The basement must remain locked at all times. 12. At dawn, you must be outside the house. Do not watch the sunrise from within. The rules bore no signature. They might have been scrawled by a servant who once worked here, or perhaps by someone who did not survive to explain them. Regardless of their origin, I took them seriously. Years of this work have taught me that the rules in haunted places are not arbitrary. They are warnings carved out of pain, left by those who came before. The first time I saw Harrington House in person, it loomed out of the fog like something exhumed rather than built. The structure was immense, with steep gables and rows of windows that resembled dark, sightless eyes. Its once white exterior had weathered to a sickly gray, streaked with rain rot. Vines clung to its walls like skeletal fingers, and the iron gate that encircled the property was flecked with rust. I remember pausing at the threshold, the list of rules crumpled in my pocket, and wondering how many before me had read the same words and crossed this same path. Inside, the air was heavy, stagnant, as though the house had been holding its breath for years. The foyer stretched high above me, a cathedral of wood and shadow, dominated by a massive portrait at the far end. It depicted a man in 19th century dress, stiff with dignity, his eyes painted with unnerving precision. I did not need to check the list to know which rule applied to him. The first day was uneventful. I walked the halls, cataloging the rooms. The mansion contained over 30 chambers, most layered in dust and cobwebs. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house, though it was still early in the day, far from midnight. The mirrors on the second floor were veiled with cloth, which suggested that someone before me had honored the second rule. The kitchen was stocked with rusting utensils but no food. I noted the fireplace, which appeared dormant. The clocks. There were many. Tall grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, even pocket watches sealed in glass cases. Their faces all pointed to different times, their ticking absent, as though time itself had abandoned the house. As daylight dwindled, the silence thickened. Old houses creak, but this one seemed to sigh. I set up my recording equipment, infrared cameras and motion sensors, more for procedure than expectation. I had learned long ago that spirits rarely reveal themselves through devices. They prefer to touch flesh, not wires. Still, I felt safer with the red lights blinking in the dark. That night, as I prepared to sleep in one of the smaller bedrooms, I followed the 9th rule and draped cloth over the clock in the corner. Its face was cracked, yet I had the sense it was watching me. Covering it gave me little comfort. I lay in bed with my journal on the nightstand, noting the stillness of the house. My eyes closed slowly, heavy with travel and tension. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to sound. Not a creak or a sigh, but singing. A woman's voice, distant yet clear, threading through the corridors. The melody was soft, almost mournful, a lullaby with no words. My instinct was to rise, to trace the sound, to capture the evidence my employers had paid for. But the rule burned in my mind: if you hear a woman singing, do not seek the source. So I stayed in bed rigid, heart pounding. The voice drifted closer, then paused outside my door. I clutched the blanket tighter. After a moment, it moved on, fading down the hall, until the silence returned. Sleep did not return with it. When dawn finally broke, I obeyed the final rule and stepped outside before the first light filled the halls. The air beyond the gate was crisp, and the forest swayed with morning wind. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The house had not claimed me, at least not yet. But as I turned back, I saw the curtains of an upstairs window shift, though every room I had checked the day before was empty. Someone, or something, was already watching. And that was only the first night. The second morning, I remained outside longer than necessary, unwilling to step back into the mansion's stale breath. The forest that surrounded the property was not comforting, but it was alive. Birds called to one another from the trees, a squirrel skittered along a branch, and sunlight dappled the undergrowth in warm patches. I had spent my life exploring places rumored to be haunted, yet I realized how rarely I had appreciated the simple miracle of normal sounds: wind, leaves, animals going about their business without malice. Harrington House made me long for the ordinary. By mid-morning, discipline compelled me to return. This was not a vacation. I was under contract, and if the owners demanded a month's worth of investigation, then I had to face 30 dawns like the one I had just endured. I walked back through the iron gate, its hinges groaning, and mounted the steps to the massive front door. When I opened it, the air seemed colder than the night before, though the sun had already risen. I tried to convince myself it was only the house's design, its high ceilings trapping shadows and draft. Convincing myself was the only way forward. I spent much of that day documenting the architecture. Harrington House was designed in the Gothic Revival style, with pointed arches and ribbed woodwork carved by hands that must have bled for their detail. The east wing contained more rooms than the floor plan suggested, narrow hallways twisting at illogical angles. One chamber opened into another without apparent order, as though the house itself had grown instead of being built. The mirrors there were uncovered, each framed in ornate silver. I resisted the temptation to examine them closely, obeying the second rule. A sheen of dust obscured the glass, but every time I passed one, I had the uncanny sensation that something behind the surface was moving just out of sight. In the afternoon, I returned to the foyer and stood before the enormous portrait of the man I assumed was the patriarch of the Harrington family. His face was long, his jaw sharp, his eyes dark wells painted with almost unnatural depth. I remembered the rule forbidding me from looking at him after dusk, but daylight offered no safety. The artist had captured something too precise, too alive. I found myself whispering, "Who were you?" under my breath before turning away quickly. That evening, as I made my notes, I noticed a new sound, the steady ticking of a clock. The clocks had all been silent the day before. I followed the sound through the corridor until I located a grandfather clock standing upright against the wall. Its pendulum swung lazily, though no one had wound it. I reached to cover its face with cloth, but before my hand touched the glass, the pendulum froze mid-swing. The ticking ceased. I withdrew my hand. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, for it carried a suggestion that the house had reacted to me. I forced myself back to the bedroom before midnight, covering every clock in the vicinity. I had chosen the same room for consistency, though I was beginning to suspect the house did not appreciate repetition. That night I lay listening to the creaks and groans, trying not to anticipate the return of the woman's song. Hours passed in silence, but then came footsteps, measured, deliberate, pacing the hallway outside my door. The rule was clear: never follow the sound of footsteps, even if they are your own. The problem was that the footsteps stopped directly outside my door, and then another set began, echoing inside the room. I bolted upright, staring into the darkness. No one was visible, yet the sound traveled across the floorboards, circling my bed. It took everything I had not to switch on my flashlight. My instincts screamed at me to illuminate the intruder, but I knew from experience that light sometimes only makes their forms more vivid. Instead, I pressed my back to the headboard and kept my eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the circling presence. After several long minutes, the sound ceased. I could still feel the weight of invisible eyes studying me until exhaustion dragged me into uneasy sleep. The third dawn found me outside once again, grateful for air that did not taste of mildew. Yet when I glanced back at the mansion, the same upstairs curtain twitched, exactly as it had the day before. The repetition unsettled me. It suggested an intelligence at work, a deliberate signal that my arrival and departure were being observed. I decided then to investigate the source of that window. It was on the second floor, near the end of the hallway overlooking the garden. When I entered the chamber, I found it abandoned like the rest, the curtains hanging limp. Dust clung to the floorboards, except near the window itself, where faint impressions marred the dust, as though fingers had been dragging along the sill. I crouched low and studied them. The marks were recent, clean through the dust, though no body had stood there in decades. It was at that window that I first heard the child. A voice, thin and high, like a boy no older than 8. "Mister," it called faintly, as if from the hallway. The sound froze my blood. The rule was explicit: should you find a child wandering the halls, do not speak to it. I turned slowly, pulse hammering, and saw a small figure standing at the far end of the corridor. The child was barefoot, his clothes old-fashioned, like something from the 19th century. His face was pale, eyes wide, and he raised one hand as though to beckon. I clenched my jaw, refusing to answer. My silence stretched heavy. The boy tilted his head, waiting. Then, when no word left my mouth, his body simply folded into the floor like a shadow dissolving, leaving nothing behind but empty air. I shut the door to the windowed chamber and leaned against it, my breath rag. The house was not content to watch me, it wanted to engage. Each rule I followed seemed less like guidance and more like a challenge the mansion resented. That evening, as I tried to eat a cold meal from my provisions, I discovered an envelope on the dining table. My equipment bag had been beside me the entire time. No one had entered the room. The envelope was ivory-colored, sealed with wax bearing a crest I did not recognize. My stomach dropped when I read the front an invitation, written in elegant script. Mr. Mercer, your presence is requested at dinner, 9 o'clock sharp. The Harrington family. My hands trembled as I set it back down. The fourth rule glared at me. Never accept an invitation to dine, no matter how it is delivered. I shoved the envelope back into my bag without opening it. But the house had its own plans. At precisely 9 o'clock, the dining room door swung open on its own, and the chandelier overhead blazed to life. The long mahogany table was no longer dusty, it gleamed. Crystal glasses sparkled, silverware shone, and platters of steaming food appeared as though conjured. Roasted meats, bowls of potatoes, loaves of bread. Everything smelled achingly real, mouth-watering after days of dry rations. At the far end of the table sat empty chairs, their backs carved in ornate Gothic shapes. I swear I could feel presences settling into them, invisible yet undeniable. The air shimmered faintly, as though heat rose from unseen bodies. A chair near me scraped back, though no one touched it. The scent of food grew overpowering, nauseating rather than enticing. I backed out of the room step by step, refusing to cross the line between temptation and damnation. Once beyond the threshold, I slammed the door. The clatter inside stopped instantly. When I dared to open it again minutes later, the table was bare, the chandelier dark, the dust returned as if centuries had never left. That night, my sleep was a storm of nightmares. I dreamt of the boy whispering secrets through walls, of the man in the portrait stepping down from his frame, of the clocks all striking midnight in unison, though their faces bore no hands. I awoke drenched in sweat, and for a moment I could not remember which world was the dream. The following morning, I began to question not only my safety but my sanity. The rules had been written for survival, yes, but obeying them was tearing me apart. To resist voices, sights, and invitations demanded a strength I did not know how long I could maintain. Yet breaking even one might mean forfeiting everything. On my 5th day, the house escalated its assault. The fireplace in the sitting room roared to life without spark or tinder. Flames licked the stone, casting the room in feverish light. The 7th rule shouted in my memory, if the fireplace lights on its own, leave the room immediately. I did. I turned and fled into the hallway, but as I glanced back, I saw shapes moving in the flames, faces screaming silently, pressed against the fire as though it were glass. They vanished the moment I blinked. I kept moving, deeper into the corridors, desperate to outpace whatever the mansion was trying to show me. But the house shifted around me. Corridors led where they had not before. Doors opened into unfamiliar chambers, and I found myself standing before a stairwell that descended into darkness. My throat tightened. The basement. The 11th rule. The basement must remain locked at all times. Yet the door now stood open, its lock broken, the stairs yawning downward into blackness. A cold draft rose from below, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and iron. I did not descend, but I lingered too long, staring into that abyss. Somewhere in the dark, I heard chains dragging slowly across the floor. I slammed the door and forced the lock closed with a chair, my pulse battering against my ribs. Every rule seemed determined to test me in rapid succession, as if the house had grown impatient with my restraint. That evening, when the sun sank once again behind the forest, I stood outside in the yard, staring up at the looming windows. For the first time since I had arrived, I allowed myself to speak aloud. my voice hoarse and angry. "I will not break your rules. I told the house. Do you hear me? I will not." The curtains in the upstairs window parted again, but this time, instead of closing swiftly, they remained open, and silhouetted against the fading light was the figure of a man. Tall, rigid, his outline too sharp to be illusion. He stood motionless, watching me. I knew then that the portrait in the foyer was no longer confined to paint, and the night was still young. I did not sleep the night after seeing the silhouette at the upstairs window. I paced the yard until dawn, too afraid to re-enter the house, too bound by the rules to stay outside once morning broke. The 12th rule was clear at dawn. I must be outside, but I could not watch the sunrise from within. That meant once daylight filled the air, I had to go back inside and endure another cycle. As I stepped across the threshold that morning, the air of Harrington House seemed different. Not heavier, sharper, as though the house had grown aware that I was resisting, and now it meant to sharpen its teeth. The floors groaned not from age, but as though they registered my weight and judged it. The silence was no longer passive, it felt like waiting. I tried to hold on to reason. I told myself the rules were boundaries, not traps, and that if I adhered to them the house could not win. So I set about my daily notes with meticulous precision. I documented the shifts in temperature, the odd acoustics of the hallways, the placement of each clock and portrait. But my writing kept trailing into repetitions, the same words appearing again and again, as though my own hand were betraying me. I would scrawl the phrase, "Don't look, don't look, don't look," without meaning to. When I realized what I had written, I nearly tore the page out, but I forced myself to leave it intact. Records are not just for clients. They are anchors for the mind. That afternoon, I felt a change in the East Wing. I had avoided it after dark, per the first rule, but in daylight I forced myself to walk its length. Dust swirled in shafts of light from narrow windows. The air there was colder, the smell of mildew stronger. When I approached one of the uncovered mirrors, my reflection seemed wrong. The angle of my head was slightly off, my eyes looking elsewhere though my real gaze was steady. I turned away quickly, pulse hammering. The second rule had not needed to warn me. Instinct told me what would happen if I touched that glass. As I left the East Wing, the singing returned. This time it was faint, like a lullaby threaded through the walls, yet not near enough to tempt me. I pressed my palms over my ears and hurried back to the foyer. But there, my eyes betrayed me. The great portrait of the Harrington patriarch loomed at the far end, and I glanced at it without thinking. Daylight still bled through the high windows, but the painting had changed. The man's head was no longer facing forward. His chin had tilted down, his gaze fixed directly on me. I stumbled back, colliding with a table. My journal slid to the floor. I forced myself to look away, to fix my eyes on the staircase until my breathing steadied. When I dared glance again, the portrait was as it had been, the man staring forward with aristocratic coldness. Yet I knew what I had seen. The rules did not forbid looking at him in the daytime, but perhaps the house was reminding me that boundaries meant nothing if it wanted them to dissolve. That night, I resolved to rest in a different room. The bedroom I had chosen no longer felt safe after the circling footsteps. I moved to the western chamber, smaller and lined with bookshelves. Before bedding down, I checked every clock and covered each one. The silence was oppressive. Near midnight, a sound startled me awake. Not footsteps this time. Laughter, high, brittle, and raw. It echoed faintly, as though coming from the walls themselves. I held my breath and listened. The laughter grew louder, shifting into multiple voices, overlapping in dissonance. My stomach turned. Then the voices began to speak, but not in any language I recognized. The syllables scraped my ears like metal dragged across stone. They rose in pitch, shrieking, until I thought my skull would split. I pressed the pillow over my head, desperate to muffle the noise, but the sound came from inside my skull as much as the walls. And then, silence. I lowered the pillow cautiously. The room seemed unchanged, yet my hands trembled uncontrollably. On the nightstand lay my journal. Its pages were open, though I had left it closed. Across the paper, in ink that was not mine, a single sentence repeated in uneven scrawl: "Eat with us. Eat with us. Eat with us." I slammed the book shut and shoved it into my pack. My breath came fast, ragged. The invitation to dine had not ended with the letter. It was relentless. The next day, I avoided the dining room entirely. I forced myself instead to map the upper floors, noting each locked door, each sealed chamber. The third floor contained rooms filled with dust, shrouded furniture, decayed wallpaper, and windows sealed with boards. Yet one chamber near the northern corner smelled strongly of roses, though no flowers existed anywhere on the grounds. Inside, a cradle rocked slowly as though stirred by unseen hands. I left immediately, the door slamming behind me, though I had not touched it. That evening, when dusk crept across the sky, I sat in the foyer, determined to confront the portrait. The rules only forbade me from looking after dusk, but I wanted to see what would happen when the moment struck. The last sliver of daylight vanished. Darkness filled the windows, and the moment it did, the painted man's head turned fully, snapping toward me with a speed too fast for paint. His lips parted, teeth gleaming white, though no breath escaped. His eyes were pits of black, bottomless. I staggered back, colliding with the staircase. The air chilled instantly, my breath fogging. Then, from the walls, came a low hum, rising, vibrating through the wood. The chandelier above shook, dust drifting down. I tore my gaze away. But even with my eyes squeezed shut, I felt his stare pressing against me, as though the painting itself had become a doorway, and something was leaning through. I fled into the western chamber, heart hammering, bolting the door behind me. That night, the singing returned. Not outside the door, but inside the room. The lullaby whispered directly at my ear, though no one stood beside me. I curled on the bed, clutching the blanket, refusing to respond. At dawn, I staggered outside like a drunkard. My body ached as though I had been beaten. I had survived, yes, but survival felt less certain each day. On the 7th morning, the house revealed its cruelty in a new form. As I prepared my equipment, a door opened in the foyer. Slowly, smoothly, without sound. From within, a figure emerged, the child again. His bare feet left no prints on the dust. His pale face tilted with curiosity. "Why won't you talk to me?" he asked softly. I kept my lips sealed, my jaw locked. He stepped closer, his eyes wet with tears. "Please, I'm lonely." The urge to comfort him nearly undid me. He looked so small, so fragile, but the rule was absolute. Do not speak. When I said nothing, his expression twisted into anger. His mouth opened impossibly wide, teeth jagged, his eyes black pits. A shriek split the air, rattling the windows, a sound no human child could produce. Then he crumbled into dust that vanished before touching the floor. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my ears, the echo of that sound still vibrating in my bones. The house was escalating, testing me harder, punishing me for endurance. I realized then that 30 days might be impossible. My employers could demolish Harrington House 100 times over. It would not matter if I did not survive the month. That night, I heard something I had dreaded since the beginning, my own footsteps. They echoed down the corridor, matching my pace, though I stood still. When I tried to move, the echoes moved in opposite rhythm, approaching fast. I pressed myself against the wall, refusing to follow, refusing to break the rule. The air chilled around me, my breath white in the dark. The echoes stopped inches away, and for one dreadful moment, it felt as though someone stood directly in front of me, their face nearly touching mine. Then the footsteps receded into nothingness. When dawn broke, I stumbled outside once more. But this time, I was not alone. At the edge of the forest stood three figures. They were indistinct, like silhouettes carved from mist, but tall and unmoving. They did not shift or breathe. They only faced the mansion. I shouted at them, but they made no reply. When I blinked, they were gone. I turned back toward the house, and for the first time I admitted the truth I had been denying. Harrington House was not only haunted, it was inhabited, occupied by something that obeyed no human law. And those rules, as arbitrary as they seemed, were not protections. They were negotiations. A contract. And contracts are always written by the stronger party. By the 8th dawn, my body was failing. Each night left me weaker. And every day the house invented new torments. The list of rules had once seemed like a lifeline, but now it felt more like a leash. I could not stop obeying, because to disobey meant death, yet obedience itself was hollowing me out. The mansion was not content to frighten me. It wanted to erode me, to grind down my reason until I was raw enough to accept its bargains. When I stepped inside that morning, I felt the air pulse. It was not a trick of nerves. The entire house inhaled. I stood in the foyer and realized that for the first time, I did not feel like an intruder in a ruin. I felt like prey entering the jaws of something that had been waiting. The portrait of the patriarch hung silent at the end of the hall, yet I dared not glance at it. I kept my head down and forced myself into the west chamber to organize my notes. My journal pages were warped from sweat, the ink blurred, but still I wrote day 8. Entity growing stronger. Rules holding, for now. That afternoon I decided to test the boundaries. I had followed the rules without fail, yet the house escalated anyway. Perhaps obedience was not survival. Perhaps resistance was. I retrieved my camera and crept toward the dining hall, intent on provoking evidence. The door was ajar inside. The table was once again laid for a feast. Roast meats glistened, bread steamed, wine shimmered in crystal goblets. At the far end, where before I had sensed only presences, there now sat figures. Not solid, not flesh, but outlines of men and women drawn from smoke, seated upright, their hands resting on the table. Their faces were blurred, yet their eyes glowed faintly, as though coals smoldered inside their skulls. One of them raised its head and looked directly at me. Its mouth opened, though no sound came. Another raised a goblet. A third extended a hand in invitation. My throat clenched. The rule thundered in my mind, never accept an invitation to dine. My hand trembled as I lifted the camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit the room for half a second, and when my vision cleared, the table was bare, the chairs empty, the dust thick once more. When I checked the camera screen, the photograph was pure black, though the memory card confirmed it had been taken. That night, the retaliation came. As I lay in bed, every clock in the house began ticking at once. A cacophony of gears and pendulums, filling every corridor with relentless rhythm. I pressed the pillow over my head, but the sound grew louder, until it felt like my heartbeat had synchronized with the clocks. Then, in perfect unison, they all chimed midnight. The walls shuddered, my lamp shattered, and the door to my room burst open. He entered. The man from the portrait stepped through the threshold, tall and rigid, dressed in 19th century finery that looked untouched by dust. His face was exactly as painted. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, lips curved in the faintest smile. But he was no canvas. He was real. "You read the rules," he said. His voice was deep, cold, echoing through the chamber, though his lips barely moved. "And yet you stay." I could not speak. My throat had locked. He stepped closer, his boots silent against the wood. "Do you think they protect you? Do you think obedience earns favor?" He leaned down, his eyes inches from mine. "They are not rules. They are invitations. I shook my head violently. His smile widened, splitting too far, exposing teeth that seemed longer than human. Every soul who enters this house writes their own survival. Those words in your pocket are the remnants of others. They failed. You will fail too. He straightened, and the room grew impossibly cold. Behind him, the walls darkened, as though the house itself were bleeding shadow. I forced my voice through my throat. I will not break them. His expression sharpened into hunger. Then you will starve. And with that, he dissolved into smoke that seeped into the cracks of the floor. The clocks fell silent. I sat frozen until dawn. On the 9th morning, I considered leaving for good. My contract meant nothing compared to my survival. But when I tried to cross the iron gate, I found it locked. I had never locked it myself, yet now the mechanism would not budge. No matter how I strained, the bars held. The house had closed its jaws. That night, the woman's song returned. This time it came not from the hall, but from inside my room. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head, refusing to listen. The melody grew louder, angrier, until it became a shriek. The windows shattered inward, glass spraying across the floor. I curled beneath the blanket, praying for dawn. But dawn did not come. I awoke to find the light outside still dark, as though night had refused to end. The clock showed no hands. My watch was frozen. Panic clawed at me. The 12th rule demanded I be outside at dawn. But what if dawn never arrived? Was the house bending time itself, trapping me in perpetual night? I staggered into the corridor, desperate. The mansion was alive with sound. Footsteps, laughter, the scraping of chains from the basement, the rocking of the cradle upstairs. Every rule at once, every warning manifesting together. The air vibrated with energy, a storm of spirits pressing against me. I ran, through the foyer, past the portrait whose eyes now followed me openly, into the east wing where mirrors rippled like water. Reflections lunged toward me, their hands pressed against the glass, their mouths mouthing silent pleas. I did not touch them. I kept running. At last, I reached the front door. It stood open, wide, spilling moonlight onto the steps. I staggered through, half believing freedom was mine. But outside, the world was wrong. The forest was gone. The gate was gone. Only darkness stretched in every direction, an endless void. Harrington House stood alone on an island of stone, floating in nothing. The door slammed behind me. I turned slowly, heart quaking, and saw that the mansion was no longer ruin. Its walls gleamed white, its windows lit with golden glow, its roof pristine. Laughter and music spilled from within, the sound of a gala in full swing. Through the glass panes of the foyer, I saw people dancing, their faces blurred, their movements graceful. The house was showing me itself alive, and then the man stepped onto the balcony above, the patriarch. His eyes burned like coals. He raised his hand in welcome. "Come," he said, his voice filling the void. "You have already dined with us in dreams. One word, and you will dine for eternity." I realized then the truth. The rules were not written to keep me alive. They were designed to keep me from belonging to him. Every command was not a prohibition but a choice point. To break them was to accept his offers to eat, to follow, to listen, to touch. To keep them was to resist, and resistance was the only shred of self I had left. I shouted into the void, my voice breaking, "I refuse!" The laughter ceased instantly. The music died. The figures in the windows froze. The patriarch's smile faltered. "You refuse?" His voice shook the air. "Yes," I said, louder, though my knees trembled. "I refuse your food. I refuse your song. I refuse your lies. I refuse you." The mansion shuddered. Cracks split the pristine facade. The golden glow flickered, revealing rot beneath. The figures in the windows twisted, their blurred faces stretching into screams. The balcony splintered beneath the patriarch's feet, and he howled, not in anger, but in something like despair. the void collapsed. Darkness surged inward, swallowing the house, the balcony, the music, everything. I woke on the grass. The sun blazed overhead. The forest surrounded me once more. Harrington House loomed behind, rotted and gray, its windows black. My body ached. My skin cut by glass, but I was alive. The rules fluttered from my pocket, the paper now blank, every word erased. I did not question my survival. I staggered to my car, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove until the mansion was only a memory in the mirror. I never returned. The owners received my report, a single page with only 4 words written at the center: demolish it at once. Whether they listened or not, I cannot say. I only know that sometimes, in dreams, I still hear the faint echo of a lullaby, and when I wake, my clocks are never where I left them. My name is Daniel Merritt. I am 31 years old, a claims adjuster by trade, and until last month I had never spent a night alone above 10,000 feet. I was raised in Pueblo, educated in Fort Collins, and eventually settled into a 1-bedroom apartment in Denver, where my most reliable view of nature is the pigeon who has learned my window schedule better than my friends have. I am the son of Margaret, the cautious one in a family of cautionary tales, and nephew to her younger brother, Jonathan Merritt, who lived like a rumor guide trapper, sometime carpenter, and, if you believed half of what he wrote in his Christmas cards, negotiator with storms. On the morning of June 3rd, an attorney with a careful voice called to inform me that Uncle Jonathan had died in late May of a fall near his property, and that he had left me the cabin that had kept him half wild, and my mother half resentful for 20 years. I took the call in the hallway outside my office, while the coffee machine gurgled, and then fell quiet, as if it too had decided to listen. When the attorney asked whether I was willing to accept the bequest, I said yes, as though I were agreeing to sign for a package. I did not say that my uncle had been the only adult in my childhood who never asked me to be less curious than I was. 2 days later, I took the afternoon off and met the attorney, a man named Coulson, whose tidy mustache made me think of a chevron painted above a doorway. He handed me a manila envelope that had been kept in a safe. The envelope contained the deed, a set of keys on a brass carabiner, 3 dog-eared photographs of the cabin that might as well have been 3 versions of the same thought: timber, stone, snow, and a single sheet of yellow legal paper torn raggedly at the top. At first I thought the paper held a shopping list in my uncle's blocky, sure handwriting. Then I read the first line rules for the Merritt place, to be read at the kitchen table before the stove is lit and obeyed without ceremony. If you are reading this, boy, your mother has not stopped you, and I am therefore addressing a stubborn man who might lie. The rules followed in a series that were not neat, but were careful, which is a kind of neatness. I read them standing in the office lobby until the receptionist asked if I needed a glass of water. I told her I was fine, which is what people say when a stranger's kindness startles them. I drove up on a Saturday because I didn't trust myself not to postpone it until the story of the cabin became a thing I told at bars and never lived. The weather was clear and behaved like a brochure, the sky so clean that the distance between one ridge and the next looked like it had been polished. I took I-70 through the canyon and then peeled off onto a county road that pretended to be paved and then stopped pretending. The air thinned and sharpened. Somewhere between the last mailbox and the first patch of lingering snow, I began to feel the way I do when I'm about to open a file at work that has already made someone else cry. The cabin stood in a small cup of land at the end of a track rutted like old scars. It had the shape of a promise made by hand. The logs were dark and straight. The roof carried a burden of weather with the unmoved patience of something that had outlived every explanation of it. The creek at the property's edge wore sunlight critically. The whole place felt less remote than reserved. There is a difference. Remote is indifference. Reserved is attention withheld until you prove yourself. I let myself in. The front door opened onto a narrow room that had more window than wall and more shadow than window. The kitchen was a single run of counter across from a wood stove big enough to specify its own climate. Above the stove, a row of iron hooks waited like punctuation. There was a table in the center. The chairs around it looked like witnesses. On the table, an ash, gray ceramic bowl held a haphazard drift of pine cones. And next to the bowl sat a jar of salt sealed with wax, which felt like a joke until I remembered the paper in my jacket. I set the envelope down and took out the rules again. I read them at the kitchen table, because the first line had told me to, and because I felt foolish enough not to dare disobey. The paper was warm from my pocket. The handwriting did not waver. The rules were as follows, as best as I can recall them, for I will not pretend that I did not stop and start and read some sentences twice and others 3 times. 1. The stove does not burn wood after 12:13 a.m. If you need heat after that hour, wear the heavy coat behind the bedroom door. If you think you can keep the fire banked, you are thinking wrong. 2. Do not look at the ridge on the nights when the moon is full enough to read by. If you must walk out to shut the generator, keep your eyes on the path. If someone calls your name from the ridge, it is not me. 3. The cellar door remains bolted at all times. If you hear knocking from below, speak clearly and say, "Not tonight." If you are offered a second chance, take it with your mouth shut. 4. Keep the salt jar full and the line across the threshold unbroken. If the line is broken in the morning, sweep it back together with the birch broom and do not say why. 5. Do not give your name to strangers after sundown on this property or within a quarter mile of it. Do not accept the names they offer unless you have heard those names from me. 6. If the radio starts on its own after dusk, turn the knob all the way left, then right, and then left again. If you hear whistling, you are already late. 7. A woman in blue will sometimes stand by the creek on the first thaw night and ask for a drink. Do not offer her water from your hand. If you must be kind, point to the creek. She won't step in. 8. Never hang a mirror where it can see the front door. If you must keep one, face it to the wall at night and cover it with a cloth. If a cloth goes missing, it wasn't mice. 9. If the phone rings at 20:17 in the morning, let it ring. If it stops and rings again, let it ring. If it speaks without ringing, whatever you do, do not answer with a greeting. 10. Count the nails in the lintel above the door every Sunday morning. If the number is different from 30, 7, go to town. I have transcribed them as faithfully as memory permits. My uncle had added notes in the margins that were not so much explanations as even more rules. Next to the stove line he had written, "Don't argue." Next to the cellar instruction he had written, "That means you." The effect of these comments was not to make me laugh, though I did. It was to make me imagine the number of mistakes that had taught him to write them. I unpacked as if the house were passing me through customs. The bedroom smelled like cedar and work. The bedstead was iron. The quilt was heavy enough to quiet a conversation. On a peg behind the door hung the heavy coat, an old parka with a patched elbow and a zipper that had known storms. I tried it on and felt like a respectable picture of somebody's grandfather. I took it off and hung it back up in case I was borrowing more than clothing. When you spend your days cataloging small disasters, the fender benders and kitchen floods, the vanishing ring and the broken wrist, you develop either morbid humor or reverence for procedures. My uncle had spent his days in a place that did not accept forms. He had still written down how to survive it. I decided to speak aloud to the empty room, because speaking to an empty room is a way to demonstrate that you accept it might not be empty. "All right," I said, "I am Daniel. I have the code. I understand the stove curfew. I will not look at the ridge if the moon goes theatrical. I will not be polite on the telephone." It felt performative and superstitious. It also felt like fastening a harness you do not expect to need. The afternoon passed into that long blue slope of evening you only get at altitude, where the light stretches and decides to see what happens if it doesn't leave quite yet. I walked the property lines because that seemed like something a person does when he is pretending to be his uncle. The creek spoke between its teeth. Up on the ridge, the timberline made a hard thud against the sky. It would have been easy to look too long. I looked down. I found the generator shed and checked the fuel. The shed had a padlock that was shiny in the hinge, as if somebody had been opening it just to make sure it still opened. The cellar doors were the opposite gray wood, heavy, with a bolt that wanted to be left alone. I touched it without lifting. I felt through the bolt the echo of my uncle's hand, and the day he last lowered it. Back inside, I fixed dinner clumsily with the sort of care that pretends not to be fear. I ate at the small table with the salt jar between me and the door. The silence around me felt like a type of crowd. When the light went, I lit the stove and watched the flames establish themselves, first as suggestion and then as confidence. Heat grew like an argument I didn't want to win. The stove's iron belly ticked, and with each tick I thought of the time written on the first rule, 12:13 a.m. The specificity of it annoyed me. It was the sort of detail that dares you to call it superstition. I don't know if you have ever waited for a superstition to arrive. It is slow. It is shy. It is like watching a deer step into a clearing grace weighted by caution. When the clock on the wall crept toward midnight, I added a log and told myself it was my last for the night. I had kept the stove modest, and the cabin held the warmth generously, like an old person offering you the best chapel. The minute hand rolled over the top. I reached for the poker and tamped the coals until they bedded down in their own red country. It felt like tucking in a dog. I brushed a line of salt across the threshold, because not to do so would have felt like reading a recipe, and then refusing to preheat the oven. The birch broom had a handle smoothed by use to a degree that told me it had not been kept for show. The salt hissed where it met wet boot tracks from my earlier explorations. The hiss reminded me of the creek. The memory of the creek reminded me of the note about the woman in blue. I told myself that the woman in blue was a story invented to keep bored teenagers from breaking in. The trouble with telling yourself a story, even a skeptical one, is that you have to say the words in your head, which means you have already made space for them. When I went to bed, I left the bedroom door open to the main room, as if I wanted to keep an eye on the stove and everything else that could burn. The moon, not yet full but practicing, set itself on the window like a hand on a shoulder. I lay under the weight of the quilt, aware of my breath in a way I am usually only when I am running or lying. The clock in the main room ticked in a language that meant I was new. I drifted in and out, and had the sort of dream that steps aside as soon as you look at it. The event of the night did not begin spectacularly. It began with the sound of the radio, though I had not noticed a radio in the room before. A thin music, the kind that might have been a weather report 2 counties away, rose stubbornly and mild from the shelf by the stove. I sat up. The clock read 12:47. I considered not getting out of bed, but the rule about the radio had not contained a flexible clause. I went to the shelf and found the radio, a gray box with a handle polished to an honesty that meant it had been carried often. The dial was a single plastic wheel. When I put my hand on it, The sound sharpened. I turned the knob left. The noise dissolved. I turned right. It returned not louder but nearer, like a conversation leaning in. I turned left again. The sound stayed away. I let go of the knob and waited. Nothing. I went to sit back on the edge of the bed. The radio began to whistle. It was not a musical whistle. It was the shape of a whistle with the friendliness removed. It was the human attempt to imitate a bird that had once imitated a human. It was, and here my mind supplied this interpretation without consulting me, my uncle's whistle, the sharp, tone call he used to use in the grocery store to signal that he had found the bread. I had not heard that call in years. It was a sound tailored to my attention. The rules had said, if you hear whistling, you are already late. I went back to the radio and did nothing because the rule had not specified what to do next, which is the kind of not knowing that turns hands into ornaments. The whistling went on for a length of time that made me feel childish. Then, very softly, from beneath the floor, something knocked. I stood very still. The knock came again, 3 taps separated by patience. I remembered the cellar and the bolt in the line about speaking clearly. I said, "Not tonight." I did not whisper. Whispering would have been the same as telling whatever was listening that I accepted its terms. The knock stopped as if I had embarrassed the knocker. I wanted to say thank you, but I remembered the next line. If you are offered a second chance, take it with your mouth shut. I closed my mouth and held my breath and listened to my heart in my teeth. The radio fell quiet, as if it had simply run out of being the wrong thing at the wrong time. The stove exhaled. The porch boards creaked in a way that suggested a change in temperature rather than a visitor. I returned to bed and lay on top of the quilt, as if I needed to be available for further instructions. The rest of the night stretched and stretched, and then suddenly broke like a rope. I woke to gold light prying at the window. The clock was honest enough to say that it was almost 8. I had slept after all. It felt like permission. In the morning, there were small differences. The salt line across the threshold had been disturbed. Not crossed exactly. The grains had been rearranged into long slurs that pointed inward, then stopped. I fetched the birch broom and pulled the line back together in a steady sweep. While I swept, a detail irritated me without telling me why. I lifted my head and counted the nails in the lintel above the door. 37. I had not counted them the night before, because rules that return every week are designed to lull you into thinking that you can ignore them in the days between. I counted again anyway. 37. The number felt all right in my mouth. I spent the daylight replacing the familiar terrors of night with the familiar chores of morning. I walked to the generator and checked the oil. I cleared winter, shed branches from the path to the creek. I opened the cellar doors just enough to look down into a cool, honest smell. The stairs vanished into a square of penumbra that would have looked like safety if it were in a different house, and carried a different set of sentences in my head. I shut the doors and set the bolt lightly, as if some of the difficulty of the world were in the way we insist on slamming things. I told myself that I was being gentle. I was also being watched. I cannot deliver proof. I can only tell you what I felt between shoulder blades that had learned to carry city weight. In the afternoon, a truck came up the ruts and stopped just inside the polite zone. The driver was a man with a beard trimmed into confession and eyes that made you suspect he had practiced looking harmless. He raised an open hand and called, "You must be John's nephew." He did not ask for my name. I gave him a version of a nod that says a person is willing to listen, but has not elected to participate. He gave me his name as if offering a dry match. "Name's Calder. I run the store down in town. Folks come in for bait, beer, sunscreen in June, snow shovels in September. I brought up some groceries. Your uncle had a standing order for every season. He lifted a box from the truck bed, and I saw that it contained flour, coffee, a bag of dried beans, a bottle of whiskey, and a coil of rope that looked like it preferred not to be coiled. We sat at the table with the salt jar politely between us. Calder told me about the spring that had failed 2 years ago and the storm that had torn the roof off the lodge a decade before that. He told me about my uncle's dog, a red mutt named Vigo who had died of old age under the table, and about my uncle's habit of paying in cash with bills folded into precise squares. He did not tell me how my uncle had died beyond the fall the attorney had described. I did not ask. There are questions that pick themselves up and sit at your elbow for you. He glanced toward the ridge. You get any noise last night? He asked, the way someone might ask, you get any elk? I told him the radio had misbehaved. He nodded as if complimenting a child who had named a shape correctly. Yeah, he said. First night welcomes are loud up here. They quiet some if you do what you're told. He stood, said he'd be back in a week if I didn't come down first. And then he paused with his hand on the door, as if remembering the script his aunt had once handed him in a church basement. Don't sign anything you didn't read. Don't read anything you didn't write. He smiled courtly and left before I could explain that I was a professional reader of other people's disasters. The second night arrived as if it had been following me all day. I banked the stove before midnight and felt clumsy for feeling proud of such a small discipline. The moon was fatter and more helpful to the eye. I did not go out to the generator after dark. I did not look at the ridge. I made a line of salt like a cautious sentence. I placed a cloth over the single mirror in the bathroom and weighted the cloth with a comb in case it had ambitions. I brushed my teeth and noticed that the comb's teeth were uneven, as if it had been used once to groom something whose hair grows wrong. I told myself to be less dramatic. I told myself a good story about how mountain cabins collect mismatched utensils the way city apartments collect mismatched mugs. I went to bed and counted my breaths to keep from counting the ways a person can be wrong. The phone rang at 20:17 in the morning. The ring was cheerful and sophisticated, as if it had been taught how to happen in a department store. I lay with my hands flat on the quilt and did not move. The ring counted itself. 9 times. It stopped. Silence laid down beside me with its back turned. Then the phone rang again. I pictured the rule written in my uncle's hand. Let it ring. I let it ring. It stopped. And in the pause the cabin exhaled the way a body does after a cramp. Then a voice spoke from the telephone without the courtesy of ringing. It was my mother's voice saying my name the way she says it when she wants me not to make a joke that will make dinner last longer than it has to. Daniel, she said. Daniel, honey. Pick up. The voice did not come through the air with static and distance. It was in the room the way your own thought is in the room. I closed my eyes and pictured my mother asleep in Pueblo, her phone dark on the nightstand, the one she silences because a neighbor once but dialed at 3 in the morning and she woke convinced the building was on fire. Daniel, the voice said, please, your uncle told me to tell you it's all right now. Pick up the phone. It was a good imitation. It included the small impatience at the end of all, right, that my mother has when she's making an allowance for something she doesn't like. I said nothing, because the rules said, do not answer with a greeting, and because I'd been instructed all my life not to be rude to people who work hard at their tricks. The voice sighed, and the sigh carried the sound of my childhood refrigerator humming defeat. Then it changed. It changed the way a person's voice does when they stop acting for your benefit and speak in the tone they use for their own reflection. It said my name correctly, and the correctness was the worst part. It said Daniel, and then it said John's boy, and then it said, "You were late last night. It's no good being late up here, Dan." The Dan made my mouth taste like pennies. Nobody gets to call me that except the one person who died before I was 10 and made me think names were not permanent. The phone clicked, but the click did not end anything. The radio started to breathe without sound. The cabin waited to see if I would behave. I realized I needed to use the bathroom in the indignant way the body has of declaring itself still alive during fear. On my way back to the bed, I glanced at the window against my will. The moon had inflated to near fullness and set a plain silver on the world. Beyond the yard, the ridge rose darkly, as if someone had placed a certainty there. On the ridge, a scatter of pale shapes stood very still. They might have been stones. They might have been patches of late snow. They might have been something the mind uses to keep itself from multiplying possibilities. I looked down fast, as if I had been caught looking at something private. The floorboard near the cellar door creaked. I heard, far below, the suggestion of water shifting where water does not belong. A smell rose the way a memory does. Fragment by fragment, cold iron, damp rope, and my uncle's pipe tobacco turned sore, as if it had been taught to breathe underwater. I sat on the edge of the bed with the quilt bunched in my fists and considered the arithmetic of leaving. You'd be amazed how quickly a person can calculate the distance to a truck, the number of stairs, the number of ruts that will try to teach the tires to quit. Then the arithmetic undid itself the way a long division chalk too fast does when the teacher looks up. I had said I would stay a week. I had told my mother I would see what needed doing and do it. I had endured worse nights in city apartments when sirens played every part. This was only sound and rule and the knowledge that a man I loved had left a list because he knew something I did not. I lay back and forced my eyes open because I had learned as a child that falling asleep before the second act increases the chance you will miss the part where the explanation occurs. The phone did not ring again. The radio kept its breath to itself. Somewhere in the structure, a mouse made a horizontal sound. I counted nails in my head and got to 37 without liking how proud I felt. At dawn, the birch broom leaned against the wall as if it had listened all night and chosen sides. The salt line was unbroken except in one small place where 2 grains had leapt the threshold as if to report back. I ate beans and coffee and decided to earn daylight by walking down to the creek. The water ran with a speed that seemed embarrassed. On the opposite bank stood a woman in a blue dress that belonged to no year I could name. She was bare, armed, and her hair was dark as a folded coat. She did not look up. She held her hands cupped together at her waist, as if already ready to receive what she would ask for. I understood 2 things: that if I spoke first, I would have broken a rule in spirit, if not in letter, and that if I looked away, I would never be able to describe her face, even to myself. She raised her head and her mouth was dry and polite. "Sir," she said, which is a word that transforms a man into his hat. "Is there water?" I gestured at the creek because I had been given that portion of mercy. She looked at it as if I had suggested she drink a rumor. "From your hand," she said. It was the voice of someone who has lost things large and small and does not yet know which are which. I shook my head because I had been told not to be kind in that particular way. She lowered her hands. "All right," she said. And the words were wrong the way a perfectly shaped icicle is wrong once you have seen it fall. She remained there for a long time, and then was not there in the way that makes you suspect she had changed her mind rather than vanished. When I turned from the creek, I saw that I was not alone by the path. A man stood among the firs just uphill, not hiding and not arriving. He wore a green jacket with a Forest Service patch, and the disappointment that belongs to it, though he was not, I would have bet my job. An officer of anything I could safely recognize. His beard was neat. His eyes were the flat brown a lake gets when the wind decides not to flirt with it. "Morning," he said, and the word fell with the weight of something that had been said correctly many times. I inclined my head, which is how a man greets the figure of an authority he cannot name. "You Daniel?" he asked. The question felt like a trick, because it had been asked after the edge of day. The sun was above the ridge. The shadows were honest. Still, I remembered Rule 5 written in a hand that did not shake. "I'm John's nephew," I said. The man smiled without teeth. "That's so," he said, as if I had known the answer he wanted and given him the wrong one, simply to see whether he deserved it. He looked past me toward the cabin. "I'm to check that the line's still on the threshold," he said. "Make sure it's going the right direction." He seemed the sort of man who would appreciate help, even if he had arrived to judge whether I knew how to offer it. "It is," I said. "I swept it together this morning." He nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher who has discovered that his student remembered to bring a pencil. "Good," he said. "Tell your uncle I stopped by. My uncle is dead," I told him. He regarded me with a patience that made me remember all the tests I had taken in rooms that smelled like laminate. He said. He said it as though I had offered him news about a man he planned to see tomorrow at lunch. "Tell him anyhow." He stepped back 2 paces into the trees, and then he wasn't visible. The woods had not changed. The air did not hold the vacancy of a departure. I stood and counted to 30, 7, and only then turned my feet toward the cabin, because the part of me that is most rational had convinced the rest of me that it is better on familiar ground when you realize that none of the ground is familiar. I spent the remainder of that day making lists. It is how I negotiate with panic when panic is dressed like weather. I wrote down "fix the hinge on the back door" and "patch the seam in the parka" and "bring more salt," and when my pen hovered I wrote, "What if the ridge isn't a place?" The words looked like someone else's handwriting. The clouds moved across the sun, and the cabin accepted the shade without argument. Toward evening, I poured a half-inch of whiskey into a chipped mug and sat by the stove without lighting it, because the rules said nothing about when a man was allowed to think about fire. I took out my phone and held it up and watched the signal climb and fall like a tired insect. I considered calling my mother and telling her that the cabin was beautiful and odd, and that I missed her voice when it was attached to her body. I did not call. I did not want to ask her if Uncle John had ever told her what the rules cost to write. Night gathered early, the way a committee does when it has more to discuss than time allows. I went through the small motions cloth over the mirror, salt on the threshold. The stove banked before the minute hand could betray me. I lay down and closed my eyes, and they did not open until the phone spoke my name with perfect confidence. It was 2017 again exactly. The voice was not my mother's this time. It was my uncle's. It used the soft laugh at the back of my name that he saved for the days when we built things that history would call temporary. "Danny," he said, and the word was a door unbolting itself. "I need you to open the cellar." The rules leaned in around me like listeners. The phone said my name in my uncle's voice and then said, "Open the cellar." It was 2017 by the clock I had not wound. The stove had already been banked to a low red that made the iron look like a bruise, and the salt line sat across the threshold like a sentence I had underlined. The radio, quiet a moment before, drew a breath the way a body does when it means to whistle and hasn't decided which tune to be. I didn't say hello. The rules had been plain about that. I stood in the doorway between the little bedroom and the main room and stared at the shadow the cellar doors made on the floorboards. A darker square inside the dark. The phone waited. The waiting had weight. You can't keep something shut forever. The voice went on, gentle and tired. A man who had given good advice too often to be proud of it. It isn't right for the house. I made my mouth a shut place. Words wanted to crawl out anyway, the kind that pretend to be reasonable and are only panic with manners. The radio exhaled a thin note that wandered the dial without choosing a station. I went to it, turned the knob all the way left, then right, then left again. The sound went away like a bird that has decided your open hand is not an argument. On cue. The knocking came from below 3 taps, patient, equidistant, not the way a person in trouble pounds a door, but the way someone who knows their claim on you is older than panic asks to be remembered. I felt the urge to whisper back, which is a kind of obedience, and swallowed it. Not tonight, I said in a voice meant to be plain and final. The tap stopped as if I had instructed a dog that had learned the trick a decade ago. The phone sighed. You can hear a smile inside some sighs. There wasn't one here. The voice spoke my name once more, not pleading, not angry. It set my name down in the room like a thing it believed would still be there when it came back. Then it went quiet. Silence returned with its hands in its pockets. The lamp shivered. The moon pressed its face to the glass. I stood listening to the way the cabin settles. Old timber speaking to gravity without saying anything anyone else can understand. The urge to open the cellar didn't retreat so much as move behind me and stand there, polite and close. When sleep finally tricked me, it was a shallow thing, all surface, like the kind of water a person steps in and calls a river, because they can't see the drop-off yet. I woke before dawn feeling like I had been held by a stranger who thought kindly of me and still didn't have the right. The cloth I'd laid over the bathroom mirror was gone. The calm I'd set on top to wait it remained, like a small animal that has failed in its only task. I found the cloth folded once across the cellar latch. It was damp and smelled faintly of creek water and something iron and old enough to be patient. I made coffee, because that is how you remind a morning to be a morning. I swept the salt line back into a straight answer. The broom's birch twigs whispered. When I glanced up at the lintel, I counted the nails without touching them. 37. I said the number out loud as if it were a safe combination I needed to keep in working order. By late morning, the idea of town had softened from an escape to a chore. I took the track down in low gear and felt every rut argue with the tires. The store sat in its own weather, the kind of place that looks like it could survive on stubbornness even if nobody ever came again. Calder was behind the counter. He had the look of a man who has practiced patience on people and shelves in equal measure. Back already, he said. Counting change that wasn't for anyone. He said it the way a person says you're still alive to someone they mean to keep that way. I need salt, I told him, and cloths. A hand, crank light. Nails. In case arithmetic gets offended. He wrapped the salt with an attentiveness that felt like respect. You get the call? He asked, and when I kept my mouth still, he nodded as if that was the answer he'd wanted. He will ask. Not just you. Anyone who ends up holding that key. He slid a small coil of new white rope into the pile. You don't have to take that, he said. But sometimes it helps just to have a thing in your hand that has a job. What is in the cellar? I asked, hating how small the question sounded. He rubbed a thumb over a nick in the counter. Depends who you are and what you open it for, he said. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's where the house keeps the nothing, so the rest of us have somewhere to put our fear. Your uncle had an understanding with the ridge. He negotiated. He said the last word like he was ashamed to know it. With the trees, I said, though the word trees felt like a lie that wished it were true. With what the trees do when they stop being trees, he said. On the full, on the half, on the nights when you can read by the sky and wish you couldn't. He bagged the candles. Count your nails on Sunday, he added. And if they're wrong on a Wednesday, pretend it's Sunday and go to town. Sunday, I repeated as if repeating would make the world organized. Sunday is for your benefit, he said. The rest is for theirs. On my way out, he asked, she show up yet in the blue? I admitted I had seen her by the creek, and that she'd asked for water from my hand. Pointing counts as charity, he said. Don't let her climb the bank. I didn't, I said, and felt proud and mean in the same breath. Back up the track. The ridge held still in the rear view, like a thought I was not brave enough to have while moving. The cabin met me with the particular relief that comes when a door opens exactly the way it always has. The salt line was slightly frilled at one edge, a small ripple like a heartbeat in sand, and I smoothed it, banding the threshold in white. The damp cloth over the cellar latch had almost dried. I set it by the stove because warmth is a language I know how to speak. The afternoon wore itself down. I patched a seam in the parka with fishing line and a thin patience. I oiled the door hinge that had performed its complaint each time I came home. The generator purred until it didn't. A little hiccup that reminded me to treat electricity like a guest. Before dusk, I took the lantern and the rope, and because the rules don't forbid everything, the small whiskey that has never made a man braver, but sometimes keeps him still. The sky went pale, then cataract, white, that high, country trick where light seems to build from the ground. I kept my eyes on the path. The ridge stood to my right with an attention I could feel behind my ear. The generator waited steady. I shut it down, the switch a familiar sequence my hands could do even if my head were busy. In the instant after the hum ceased, something vast stepped back. The night skin tightened. Daniel, the ridge said, not loud, not far. The voice had borrowed my uncle's grain, the way a wind borrows the smell of smoke. Every nerve in my neck wanted to turn my head. I kept my gaze on my boots. You don't want to be wrong about this, the voice continued. The shape of my name dragged memory with it. The sound it made when my uncle found me behind the shed, trying to pry a knotted rope apart with my teeth. I walked back to the door and didn't hurry. Hurrying is a kind of answer. Inside, I put my palm on the cellar latch without pushing or lifting. Iron told me nothing. When the 3 taps came again from below, I said it as simply as I could. Not tonight. The latch warmed in my hand, like a breath on metal, and stilled. I slept shallow again, and stood up twice in the dark for reasons my body didn't explain and didn't have to. In the early light, I found the mirror cloth missing again. This time, the comb with its uneven teeth had been carried to the table and placed beside the salt jar like an offering someone thought was equal and wasn't. The cloth lay folded on the latch. A wet ring stained the wood under it. I could smell the creak. I counted the nails above the door and felt a child's joy when I reached 37. I said the number out loud because I had no one else to say it to. I told myself that I had done well by not opening the cellar, that this was what passing a test felt like, tired and a little foolish, with a reward you can only name by not having been punished. The road down was drier and faster that day, and the town farther away. Like a toy someone had moved 2 feet to the left while I wasn't looking. I didn't go. I split some wood. I mended a tear in the old curtain and found, pinned inside the hem, a note in my uncle's square hand. The sentences had that plain weight his rules had. If a nail falls on a day that is not Sunday, set it back to make 37. Then go sit on the steps until you understand why it fell. Do not understand too quickly. I sat with the note in my pocket and practiced not understanding. It is a skill. It turns out I barely have it. Late afternoon, the man in the green jacket with the Forest Service patch stood in the trees uphill, not near, not far. He hadn't walked up. He was just there, the way a thought is. Morning, he said, though it wasn't. Road's good, he added. You should take it while it means well. He smiled in a way that made his teeth look like a puppet's idea of teeth. You Daniel? He asked, and even though the sun would have passed any reasonable sundown line, I did not say yes. I'm John's nephew, I said. He nodded, pleased to have found the door to knock on even if I wouldn't open it. We're checking the line, he said, meaning the salt. And the number. His gaze flicked to the lintel, and when I looked the nails were as they had been. Count Sunday, he said. Trust daylight. Distrust everything that knows your name after dark. He began to tell me his name, and I raised my hand, and the expression that crossed his face then wasn't irritation. It was envy. He vanished like a bad choice you refuse fast enough to keep. At the creek toward evening she stood, the woman in blue, hands cupped, knees locked as if the ground had whispered a lie about softness. She didn't look at me. She looked at the door. When she asked for water from my hand, I pointed to the creek and felt the guilt you feel when a rule uses your conscience to push its cart. She nodded the way people nod to nurses when they are told to wait another hour for a test. She didn't step down. I did the small night things cloth and wait on the mirror. Salt like an underlined sentence, stove banked at 11s and 58, because obedience is easier when you can pretend you chose it. I left the generator running longer than I should have, and then turned it off and walked back fast, without letting fast become a statement. The phone didn't ring. It spoke at 2017, and it wasn't my uncle's voice or my mother's this time. It was mine. Come on, the phone said in my voice. The one I use at work when I have to sound reasonable a little longer than patience allows. Read the fine print. The rules were written by a man who liked writing rules. You can write new ones. You can open a door if you want to see what's behind it. That's what the word want means. I went to the table, picked up the receiver, and dropped it back on its cradle without speaking. It laughed the way I laugh when a file looks worse than the first page suggests, and still not as bad as it's going to get. Then it went quiet. Under the floor something moved with a slow insistence. A rope dragged over a nail, a heavy length of wet. The sound a river makes when it lives somewhere it shouldn't. I felt the boards remember how to be trees. I lay there and decided to keep my eyes open, and discovered that being awake is not a defense. At some point exhaustion put its hand over my mouth and said, "Hush." When dawn crawled in, the salt line had been touched twice. The marks were neat, the way children try to be neat, when they want to show you they could have made a mess and didn't. I swept and smoothed and told myself that being proud of lines was not a foolishness if the lines held. Then I looked up and counted the nails. 36. I counted again. 35. The bright new nail I had hammered the day before lay on the floor with its head toward the door, as if it had been pulled gently out and set down by something that disliked the sound of hammering and preferred a quieter way of saying no. Beside it, not far, lay an old nail, its head smooth as a coin you flip when you've already decided and just want the coin to agree. A third nail sat angled out from the lintel like a tooth worked loose by a child's tongue. I stood on the ladder and eased them back one by one. The new nail went into the gap it had already made once. The old nail returned to a place I didn't know it belonged to until it fit. The loose one needed just a tap. When the heads sat in their old constellation, I counted and got 37. The relief was the small kind that comes after you find your keys where you should have put them and hadn't. Coming down the ladder, my boot bumped the wall. The sound that sprang out of the wood was hollow and wet, as if the timber had remembered a mouth. Before noon, Calder's truck came up the track slow, like a man remembering bad weather. He carried in one hand a triangle of thick glass wrapped in a rag. "Set that on the mirror cloth," he said without preface. Laying it in my palm, glass quiets glass. He glanced at the lintel, at the nails. "Asked for you to put them back, did it?" I nodded, and he looked pleased in a way that had nothing to do with me. "Good," he said. "Means you're the right kind of stubborn." "Is there a wrong kind?" I ask. "The kind that makes you say, 'I know better than everyone who lived here before me,'" he said. "Your uncle had it from time to time, but he learned how to be tired in the right way." He picked up the comm from the table, the one the house had moved the night before, and set it back in the bathroom as if returning a borrowed tool to a suspicious neighbor. "Don't leave this where it can see the door," he said. "Teeth are mirrors if you squint." He left with the weather and I sat on the steps, because the note had told me to sit whenever I thought I understood. I watched the yard be plain. Near dusk, a hawk crossed low east to west, and the shape of it against the pale sky made the air flinch. The ridge stayed put until the light made it look like it had moved, in the way a heavy dresser looks, shifted after you decide you'll imagine it where you want it. Full moon rolled up the slope of the night. I did not go outside after the generator went down. The world cooled and then kept cooling long after it had proved the point. The radio behaved. The phone was polite. At 2 and 3 and 4 something walked the circle around the cabin, not heavy, not hooved, but deliberate, like a hand drawing a shape again and again until the pencil breaks. When I couldn't stand it, I went to the window and looked not at the ridge but at the yard, and saw the line where something had traced a perfect ring, a long mark that ignored the softening properties of snow and turned corners the way a compass turns them. Inside the circle, the fresh snow lay unbothered. Outside it, the drifts had formed little humps like animals sleeping. I put my hand flat on the glass and felt the night looking back through it. Morning made the ring look ordinary, which is the most frightening trick a morning knows. I counted 37 and felt silly to be grateful to numbers. I fixed coffee. I set the triangle of glass on the mirror cloth, like a seal on a letter you hope nobody opens in the wrong place. I took the birch broom to the threshold and rebuilt the line, grain by grain, until the white was a solid word. By mid-morning, the serviceman, if that's what to call him, stood again among the uphill trees, closer than before. From the door he looked like something a winter storm had started to make and then gotten bored with. He raised a hand like a neighbor across a fence. "Roads clean," he said. They plowed. He said they the way some people say we, when they mean the part of themselves that lives long enough to forget you. "You should head down," he added. "Don't wait for Sunday to tell you that it's Sunday. It's Thursday," I told him. "Thursday," he agreed, as if I'd offered a word from a language he enjoyed as a hobby. "Don't sign anything you didn't read. Don't read anything you didn't write." He looked pleased with the advice the way a comedian looks pleased when he's about to repeat a line that always gets a laugh. "And don't open the cellar unless you like listening to the distance between rain and flood." "What happens if I do?" I asked, because I was tired of being a person who could only say what he wouldn't do. "You get the wrong visitor," he said. "The one who already knows your small noises. He tilted his head so precisely it felt like a trick done with a hinge. "Daniel," he said, and the way he said my name made my gums itch. "It isn't only about you. The Ridge keeps a kind of book. When the door is open, the book writes back." He smiled then, a kind human smile, and scuffed his boot against the dirt like a boy. "We like you," he added. "We liked your uncle. Don't ask us to choose. He went without going. The tree's learning how to forget him. The woman in blue didn't come that day." The creak sounded like metal pushing through cloth. I spent the afternoon packing a small bag I told myself wasn't a surrender, just prudence. And then unpacked it because prudence felt like disloyalty to a house that had asked me to try. When the generator stumbled and failed that evening, it didn't come back. The hand crank light gave me a circle of moving brightness I could carry. I wounded until the muscles in my forearm burned, and then some more, as if wattage were a moral quality. The stove ticked and then slowed, and then stopped with the kind of patience that makes you want to apologize. I wore the patched parka inside. My breath made a little fog when I laughed at myself for wearing it. My laughter fogged the lamp's glass. At 2017, the phone didn't ring and didn't speak. The radio didn't breathe. The quiet stretched warm to a very fine thread. Then something tapped the window glass with the tip of something nail. Hard 3 times. As formal as the cellar knocks. I stayed where I was. A moment later, someone walked past the door. Not footsteps. The sense of a weight moving at a steady pace and brushing the boards with a courtesy that didn't belong to me. The impulse to open the door was not curiosity. It was illness. I let it pass. When the waiting felt like it would break me, a voice finally came from the phone. It wasn't my mother or my uncle or me. It was a clean, bureaucratic voice. A woman's voice. The kind that tells you your number has been called, even if you didn't choose to take a ticket. It didn't say hello. It said my full name, first and last and middle, every syllable correct, and then, "This is your last easy night." I don't know if I slept after that. I know there was a dawn. I know the salt line had been dragged through by something with 3 fingers wider apart than a person's. I know the cloth was not on the cellar latch for once, which should have been a joy and wasn't. I know the nails above the door were 30, 7 when I counted twice, and 30, 6 when I counted a third time, and 37 again when I closed my eyes and touched each head with the tip of my finger and said each number like a prayer 2 centuries older than me. By late morning, the weather changed its mind and snow began in a way that is always both a kindness and a threat up here. The flakes were large, heavy, falling slowly, as if the sky had decided to lower some of itself and see what we would do with it. I made a list of town things and didn't go. I made a list of house things and did them badly. The tracks from the night before vanished under the democratic work of weather. The ridge took the snow like a yes. Afternoon folded up. I took the lantern to the bathroom to cover the mirror and saw that the glass had fogged in a pattern I can't describe without sounding like I am asking to be believed. 3 lines, narrow and curved. Not letters but shapes that made my mouth shape vowels anyway. I wiped them with the edge of the cloth and they came back, only fainter, like something beneath the surface had made a mark, and the surface was tired of keeping the secret. I set the triangle of glass on the cloth, and the fog simply stopped. No slow fade, no argument. The air around the mirror calmed like a crowded room that has just learned what it was waiting for. I stood there with my hand on the edge of the sink until my legs remembered how to be hinges again. The woman in blue came with the first dart. She stood where the ring around the cabin had been and looked at the door as if it were an answer she had been promised and cheated of. "Please," she said, and I pointed to the creek and felt the anger she had a right to, even if she wasn't exactly a person anymore. She nodded. She did not step down. The serviceman didn't come. The phone did. 2T17 came and went, and then came back as if clocks up here could be persuaded. Open the cellar, my uncle's voice said, not asking now, not ordering, announcing. The radio agreed with a small whistle that would have been companionable if it didn't sound like it knew my bedroom. The latch under my hand didn't heat or cool. It pulsed slow, a count I couldn't match to any heart I've put my ear to in a hospital. Not tonight, I said, and my voice shook the way a rope shakes with a weight on it. Beneath the floor, something withdrew. The sound it made was not retreat. Retreat snaps twigs and says sorry. This sound was like a long body returning to the water that made it, and not letting the water change it. The floorboards remembered they were boards. The stove ticked once like a polite cough. I made it until dawn. The salt line held. The nails held. The mirror cloth was still in place under the small triangle of glass. The ring in the yard had been drawn in the night with wind. Nature does some of the work for things we don't like to name. I stepped onto the porch and the air was so clear it felt like it had been sifted. Down the track, far as it goes, the road turned white and then gray and then white again. The creek sounded like a conversation shut behind a door. A truck came up slow. Not Calder. Something older. A shape that had been a truck long enough to forget why. It stopped 20 yards out, and a tall man climbed down, no hat, no jacket. Just that white shirt men in old photographs wear when they want to pretend their work happens under roofs. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He walked to the edge of the ring and stopped with his toes touching a line he seemed to see. "Mr. Merritt," he said, and his voice made the space between my shoulder blades do a small animal thing. He didn't ask for my name. He didn't offer his. He took a folded piece of paper from his inside pocket and held it out like an invitation or a fine. "Sign," he said, and the shape of the word was the shape of a door. The rules said not to sign what I hadn't read. I didn't take the paper. He stood with his arm extended, patient as timber, while the snow came down sideways once, then straight again, as if it too were waiting. Behind him, at the far lip of the property where the trees thicken, something watched with the stillness of a fact that has decided not to be persuaded. I stood there counting without numbers, thinking of the nail heads above the door, and the triangle of glass on the mirror, and the small dip in the salt line, where something had considered and declined, and realized I was not afraid the way I had been. I was angry, a clean anger, the kind you get when someone tries to write your choices for you with the wrong pen. "I don't sign at the door," I said. "If you want to talk, come back in daylight and use your name." He smiled then, a slow bending in his face that didn't tire any muscle he would need for anything else. "There won't be much daylight left for talking," he said. He folded the paper again with care, put it away, and tapped the ring of snow with the toe of his shoe. The ring held like a closed eye. That night the generator didn't bother to try. I wound the light until it hummed, and then went quiet, and then hummed again. The stove gave up its last committed ember before midnight, and when I banked it there was nothing to bank. Only a bed of ash as patient as a beech. I wore the parka and 2 pairs of socks, and sat with my back to the couch and the rope in my hands. Tying and untying a knot my uncle had taught me that was good for keeping a boat to a dock, and he had said once, for keeping a man to a promise. I could feel the full moon lift itself onto the ridge like a coin onto a table. The phone did not ring. The radio did not breathe. At 2017, the house exhaled in a way I felt more than heard, the way you feel a subway under your feet when you stand on a city sidewalk. and lie to yourself about the ground being still. And then the first wet sound came from below, a sound like a rope pulled slow through a ring in a river. And the cellar latch rose a finger's width under my palm without anyone on either side giving it permission. The latch lifted under my palm, just a breath, just enough to prove that weight wasn't the only thing that could move iron. I pressed it down, not roughly, not like a man fighting for his life, but like someone reminding a child to sit back down at the table. The iron cooled. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see whether I would apologize for obeying. I didn't. I stayed there until my hand cramped. Then I stepped away and wrapped the rope around the handles, tying the same knot my uncle had taught me when I was small. Dock line tight, honest, a knot that can outlast second thoughts. The night went on, not kind, but not catastrophic. I must have drifted against the couch with the parka drawn up over my knees because I woke to the thin brightness of dawn, stretching through the high windows. The air was sharp enough that my breath fogged the glass as I stood to peer outside. Snow had fallen steady. The tracks I'd seen the night before were softened to vague impressions, but one detail remained, a ring drawn again in the snow around the cabin, deliberate and perfect, as if something had measured it with a compass larger than the world. Inside, the salt line was half smeared, 3 parallel marks dragged through it and then withdrawn, as if fingers wider than human had reached in, touched the room's air, and then decided to let me keep it. I swept the line clean with the birch broom, pressing the grains together, muttering a wordless tune under my breath, because silence at that moment felt like leaving the door open. I made coffee and counted the nails above the lintel. 37, 36, 38, then back to 37 again, as if the wood and the iron were playing with me. I reached up and touched each head with my fingertip, one by one, and counted aloud, slower this time, speaking each number as though it were my name. 37. They stayed put. For the moment. The day was plain at first, like days are when they know you need a reprieve. I hauled in wood, shoveled the steps, boiled beans. But under the ordinariness was a static, the kind you hear on a bad phone line, a promise that another voice is coming. The ridge loomed white and unmoving under the noon sun, but I kept my eyes low when I went out to empty the ash pan. I thought about Calder's advice. That Sunday doesn't mean Sunday so much as you'll know when it's time to leave. I began to think it was already Sunday, no matter what the calendar in my phone insisted. Near mid-afternoon, while I was sewing another patch into the parka sleeve, I heard a knock. Not the 3 taps from the cellar, not the delicate glass tapping of the night before. A proper knock on the front door, confident, knuckles on wood. I froze with the needle between my fingers. Mr. Merritt, a voice called. It was male, deep, clear, the kind of voice that belongs on radio announcements about school closures. Please, a moment of your time. I didn't move. The rules shouted in my head. Do not give your name to strangers after sundown. But it was still day, bright through the windows. Snow gleamed. The rules did not forbid strangers at noon. They only forbade me to be careless. The knock came again, patient. I stepped to the door, pressed my ear against it. The wood was cool. The voice spoke once more, closer now. This is official business. There are papers that must be seen to. The same crisp tone as the man in the white shirt who had come with the folded document. The man who wanted a signature. I didn't open. I called back. Leave the papers. I'll look. There was a pause. Then, the kind of chuckle that makes you think of gloves on hands that don't know they're human. Papers don't leave themselves, Mr. Merritt. Best to open up. Another knock. Gentle. Gentle the way a doctor asks you to breathe in before a needle. I stepped away, heart thudding. The knock didn't repeat. The silence that followed was worse. I checked the windows. Nothing. Snow lay smooth, untouched. No tracks. No man in white, no papers, no shadow. Just the ridge watching. That night the rules pressed heavier. I salted the threshold twice. I covered the mirror with both cloth and the triangle of glass Calder had given me. I banked the fire early, watching the last log collapse into orange bones. I wound the hand crank light until the muscles in my arm begged. At 2017 the phone spoke. Not a ring, just a voice. My uncle again, but different. Colder. Boy, he said. And the word was not kind this time. You're wasting time. Every night you wait, it grows stronger. I can't hold it. Not anymore. The radio picked up his words, doubling them, echoing them back like a canyon. Open it, he said, and the whistle that followed was his whistle, sharp and exact. The one he'd used to summon me as a child when he'd found something he wanted me to see. The cellar latch trembled under my palm, eager, like a dog pulling at a leash. The rope strained. A creak ran down through the boards, low and wet. For the first time the floor heaved, just slightly, but enough to send the lamp's light wavering on the walls. Something enormous shifted beneath the cabin, moving in a slow circle, the way a storm does when it hasn't yet decided where to go. I pressed the latch down. I said it steady. Not tonight. My own voice sounded strange, older, as if I'd borrowed it from my uncle's throat. The movement below stopped, not retreating, pausing, waiting. Then came a sound I cannot describe without sounding foolish. Laughter, not loud, not human. A ripple through water, low, rolling. Laughter that didn't care if I recognized it or not. And then it went still. The house settled again. The rope on the latch slackened. The radio died. The phone went cold. I stayed there until dawn. When the light returned, the salt was gone. Not scattered, not smeared. Gone. A clean wood threshold stared up at me, bare. I swept the broom anyway. An empty gesture. Desperate, as if grains might appear. They didn't. The salt jar on the table had been overturned. The grains inside it had turned black, fused together into a lump of something like glass. And that was when I realized what Calder had meant by bargains. My uncle had bargained with something on the ridge, and the payment had been rules. But rules can be broken from the other side too. The house wasn't keeping things out anymore. It was keeping me in. I dressed in the parka and boots. I took the rope, the lantern, the useless salt jar, and opened the door to leave. Snow dazzled my eyes. The track down was nearly gone under drifts. The circle around the cabin had been redrawn, deeper this time, carved into the snow like a boundary no plow could cut through. I stepped to the edge of it, breath fogging. The line ran perfect and unbroken, a prison or a seal. From the trees at the far edge of the clearing, the man in the green jacket stood watching. He raised his hand in a wave that wasn't a wave. Morning, he called. Don't waste your breath. Road's not for you anymore. And behind him, at the ridgeline, something vast and pale was moving, slow, deliberate, patient, waiting for me to choose which rule to break first. The ring cut the yard clean, as if some surveyor, with a compass the size of a wagon wheel, had come in the night and drawn a boundary in a language older than fences. The man in the green jacket stood beyond it, not smirking, not kind. Road's not for you anymore, he said, and didn't so much as touch the brim of his hat, because he wasn't wearing one and because courtesy is a kind of door. What changed? I asked, though I already knew. The salt was gone. The house had switched from keeping things out to keeping me in. Rules are also locks when you stand on the other side. You did, he said, and glanced past me at the dark seam of the cellar doors. Or you didn't. Same result. I did exactly what the rules said. I told him. You obeyed. He allowed. Obedience is a choice like any other. Sometimes it signs things you never see. He nodded toward the ridge. "They're patient up here. They don't mind waiting for a man to prove his character." "You going to help me?" I asked. "I'm preventing you," he said. And the honesty of it took the fight out of my throat. "That's the closest I get to help you'll like." Movement touched the far timber like a thought someone decided not to say. Something pale shifted in the trees, where drifted snow can't explain motion. I felt the animal urge to look and held it still. I tried the ring with a stick because sticks are what you try boundaries with when you don't want to be ridiculous and can't help it anyway. I slid it forward until the tip touched the incised line. The wood blackened like bread left under a broiler. Smoke without heat rose in a shape that wanted to be handwriting and failed. I let the stick go and it lay there bisected by the line, the outside end innocent, the inside charred. The man in green nodded once, a teacher recognizing a demonstration his student had been cruel enough to perform on his own. "What do I do?" I asked. "You know," he said, "you don't like it. I don't either." The woman in blue stood by the creek again, closer to the line than she had the right to be, hands cupped, face composed with the stubborn grace of people who have outlived their right to modesty. I pointed at the water and she looked down and then at me, and then at the ring. She did not step. I went inside because there were tasks I could still do that would make me feel like a man and not a noun. The salt jar sat on the table fused into a single lump as black as a burned sugar sculpture. I tapped it with the back of a spoon. It gave like glass. I took a knife and shaved a corner. The shavings skittered off like beetles and disappeared where they shouldn't. When I opened the pantry, I found that every box that had ever held salt had gone empty. The labels remained. The mineral was elsewhere. I stood there with the door open and thought about the way rules sometimes rearrange the inventory when you put too much faith in shelves. If the house wouldn't let me leave, I could still make it harder for whatever wanted in. The threshold was naked wood now. Salt had been its sentence. I couldn't copy the alphabet, but I could change the script. Iron likes to say no. I took nails from the counter and a file from the little tin that held my uncle's tools. I sat on the floor like a stubborn child and filed bright heads and shanks until I had a glitter of iron dust fine as pepper. I poured it into a line across the threshold, not a neat stripe so much as a heavy suggestion. I tapped 3 nail heads into the jamb on each side, not driven deep, just enough to make the doorway behave as if it remembered iron's job. When I was done, the air had a taste like pennies and stubbornness. I covered the mirror and set the triangle of glass on top and felt foolishly proud of having quieted one possible mouth. I counted nails above the lintel. 37 by finger, 36 by eye, 37 again when I counted slower and let myself be less clever. I checked the clock. Late morning. Daylight left in the bank, but I didn't trust the bank. The phone didn't wait for 2017. It rang the normal way, bright and civilized. It kept ringing until I picked it up and put it to my ear without speaking. "Delivery?" Calder said. "Human. Blessedly human? You're penned," he added. "Not cruel and not surprised. I can get to the line. I can't cross it. You need anything I can throw." "Salt," I said. "If you brought it, don't toss it. It won't behave." "I didn't," he said. "That trick they keep for themselves. I brought flour, and a thing you have to give back." "What thing?" "You'll know it when you see it." He said, which is a way to keep a man from arguing. "Stand by the door in 3 minutes. Open on my knock. Don't step over. Don't let anything else in." "Is there anything else?" He hung up with the low click of a man who respects time, because there isn't enough of it. 3 minutes later, 3 quick knocks, human, brisk. I opened to the width my shoulder would permit. The ring in the snow was a clean incision. Calder stood 5 yards beyond, winded, a burlap sack at his feet, and his hat jammed low against the weather. He lifted the sack and with a practiced throw sent it arsing. It hit the ring and split into 2 gestural. The inside half dropped straight down, as if someone had cut its motion with a knife. The outside half continued and skittered across the porch to my boots. A tin slid from it, banged and spun, and when it stopped it was still on the safe side. "Take the tin," Calder called. "Leave the bag." I bent, hooked the tin with 2 fingers, and drew it inside, as if crossing a border under observation. It was old and blue, and had belonged to cookies a century ago. The label was worn down to a ghost of a flower wreath. I cracked the lid. Inside, resting on a square of folded butcher paper, lay a ring of iron. Just a hoop, hand-forged, 2 thumbs wide, the seam where the ends met riveted shut. Around it, nested like commas, lay 37 small iron nails, their heads stamped with an X. The nails felt expensive in the way effort makes things dear. "What is it?" I asked, though I knew. "What he used to keep the count below," Calder said. "He took it up one night he shouldn't have. Said he was tired of letting numbers tell him the weather. The ridge likes when we get tired." He tugged his hat lower and looked past me. Not at the cellar, not at the stove, at the lintel. "Put the ring where it belongs. Put the nails back where they belong. Do it in daylight. Don't say anything while you do." "The ring belongs below," I asked. "Everything below belongs below," he said, "except you. Don't try to belong." Why didn't John put it back? Saying my uncle's name plain in daylight felt like an offense and a relief. "He liked to argue," Calder said. "He thought he could win a bargain by making it smarter. He did once or twice. Then he made one too many good arguments. That's how men break. They win at the wrong time." The man in the green jacket stood now nearer, not interfering, not helpful. He had the posture of a bureaucrat watching a citizen fill out a form wrong on purpose. "If you go down," he said, "just loud enough to carry. Use the rope. Tie it to something that learned how to hold before you were born." "I know knots," I said. "We know yours," he said back, and something like sympathy creased his face. "Use one you learned with your mouth shut." The woman in blue had moved closer to the ring, not at my door, but at the corner of the cabin, where the line of snow made the sharpest turn. She didn't ask for water this time. She stared at the iron tin in my hands with the attention of a starving person looking at a loaf too far away to make promises to. I shut the door. The iron in the tin felt old in the way teeth feel old. If the ring outside wouldn't let me out, I would make a ring inside that would let me live long enough to think. I tied the rope to the bed's iron foot, solid, honest iron that had learned attentiveness by holding sleeping bodies. The other end I tied around my waist with a belt's worth of extra loops and 2 knots. The dock line my uncle had taught me. Easy to undo when hands are cold, and another I'd learned from a claims investigator who'd once kept a towel line from slicing his hand, open by trusting a particular twist. I checked both knots 3 times and told myself I wasn't stalling. I took the lantern and the iron ring and the little nails. I set the triangle of glass on the mirror cloth 1 more time. I counted the lintel nails because habits are the bones of cowardice and courage both. 37. I didn't count a second time. Sometimes certainty is a lie you need. I put my hand on the cellar latch and felt nothing. No heat, no pulse. I lifted it and broke the rule because Calder had put a different rule in my hands. The smell rose. Cold iron, damp rope, tobacco turned to silt, not rot, not exactly. But the smell of things that have changed their mind about which element their loyalties lie with. The stairs were steep. The wood had been planed by shoes and years. I went down slow, the way you walk through a room where babies are sleeping and you don't know where. Light dies differently underground. It doesn't dim. It doesn't even narrow. It gets careful. My lantern's circle cut the cellar into pieces, and I moved through each piece like a surgeon choosing which tissue to trust. The earthen floor was tamped hard, smooth with the labor that turns dirt into a surface. The foundation stones were big and sober, and held their places with the seriousness of animals who have long lives. In the exact center of the room, directly beneath the table upstairs by the stove, lay a shallow depression ringed by iron. Not a chain, not a hinge. A circle of iron strap hammered into the earth, ends riveted with a welder's love, the circumference interrupted evenly by small holes. 37 holes. 36 nails. I didn't say anything. The urge to count out loud felt like walking up behind a stranger and putting your hand on his shoulder just to see what happens. I kneeled, set the lantern safe, laid the iron ring from the tin over the one set in the earth to see how they related. They were twins. My uncle had stolen the seller's jewelry and worn it to a party he hadn't been invited to. I matched the rivet seams. The ring in my hand had a discoloration where someone had once heated it too hot and then decided to pretend the color didn't mean anything. One of the nails missing from the circle lay in the dirt just outside the depression, as if it had been popped loose by a careful thumb and then toyed with like a coin a man can't decide to spend. The head had the same stamped X. I set it between my teeth to hold it. The metal tasted like patience. Something moved in the packed earth within the iron ring. Not an insect, not a rodent. A swell, a breath. The way a gopher makes a hill except from a direction gophers don't have contracts with. Water whispered below, far down, the kind of persistent talk that wore canyons clean. The rope at my waist tugged once as it settled and made me feel safer than the lantern did. I started placing nails, one by one, slow. I pressed each into its hole and felt the earth remember it. I used the hammer only when a shaft resisted, and even then I tapped like I was waking someone I owed. I didn't count. I let my hands do the counting. When I reached the empty hole that matched the nail between my teeth, I took it from my mouth and pushed it in. It went easy, like apology. Something exhaled beneath the floor. Not a gust, not a draft, a release. The rope tightened enough to make me aware of my waist. The lantern's flame fluttered, regained itself, then lifted taller by a fraction, as if the air had been given extra permission to be air. The sound of water dimmed by a hair's breadth. It had been talking loud. It had been told to hush. I set the last nail. 37. I did not say the number. I lifted the iron hoop from the tin and laid it over the embedded ring. Where the seams met, the discolorations matched like old scars aligning. The hoop sat with no protest. I pressed down. It warmed under my palm, not with heat but with recognition. Behind me upstairs, in the far room where the mirror hung facing the wall like a punished student, glass cracked. Not a shatter. A single line. A complaint. Take it with your mouth shut. The rules had said. I kept my mouth shut. A thin voice came from the iron, from the floor, from nothing. It said my name like a key someone had copied badly. It tried again. It got the vowels right and the shape wrong, like a man whistling a hymn he'd only heard once on the road past a church. The rope tightened by another degree, not pulling, just reminding me that I was attached to something that had chosen me before I chose it. I rose, not because I was done, but because I understood that what remained didn't require hands. I backed to the stairs and climbed without turning. The lantern threw my shadow up the steps like a man caught in his own test. At the top I closed the cellar doors and set the latch and tied the rope around them, because that is how you tell a house you are not being careless even when you are being brave. Outside, the man in green had his head tilted like someone listening for a train. He looked toward the ring in the snow without moving his feet. "Again," he said, almost to himself. The line, a perfect circle 10 minutes ago, had developed a seam near the track, a thin gap no wider than a boot sole, a crack the way lake ice cracks when spring wants to be noticed. The woman in blue took a single step toward it and stopped, as if the ground had told her a secret at town volume. I put on the parka and my boots and took the keys and the little bag I had packed twice and unpacked twice. The iron filings on the threshold had held their dull glitter. I stepped over them and onto the porch, and then to the edge of the ring. Calder stood beyond, closer now, one hand out, not an invitation, in measurement. "You made a door," he said. "Don't argue about whether you deserve it." The man in the green jacket was less pleased. "Everything that leaves opens something else," he said. "That's how air behaves. You're going to close what you open."
If I can.
I said. "If you can't," he replied, and didn't give me a sentence to finish. I put my boot into the gap. It felt like nothing. Not cold, not heat, not resistance. An absence of sensation, like stepping through the place where a tooth used to be. I slid the other foot after and stood with one leg in my yard and one leg in what counted as the world. Nothing exploded. The sky did not turn itself inside out. The ridge watched. The woman in blue watched the iron tin in my hand. The gap did not close. I stepped the rest of me through and stood on the far side of a circle I had pretended was a compass and discovered was a moat. "Truck?" Calder asked. "Practical or boots?" "Truck," I said, because distance is a bully. He nodded, and we walked together along the edge of the ring to where my truck waited with snow crusted in its wheel, wells like an old dog's whiskers. The white shirt man stood in the track by the driver's door, the paper already unfolded, gray tie neat against a chest that did not seem to notice weather. He didn't look at the ring. He didn't look at me. He looked at the space above my left shoulder, as if he had been assigned to treat a spot on the air, and not a person. "Sign," he said, as mild and inevitable as rust. I put my hand on the door handle and did not move it. I tried to see the letters on the paper without moving closer. My name, middle, last, the parcel number from the deed, the road designation the county liked to pretend existed. "Red," I said. He smiled as if I had made a joke he had heard in 10,000 kitchens. "You don't want to," he said. "You like language too much. It's a trick door for you." "I won't sign what I don't read," I told him. He didn't sigh. Men like him don't have lungs. "Then don't read what you shouldn't sign," he said. He folded the paper crisp once and held it out to me over the ring. The edge drifted toward the gap and then stopped, as if the line had grown a lip. The paper's corner curled black and left a clean rectangle missing when he drew it back. He frowned, not at me, at the arithmetic of the world failing to reconcile to his ledger. "Daylight," Calder reminded me softly. "Spend it." The man in white took one step back. He was not angry. He only looked like a man asked to perform extra work for which he had not been paid. "We're patient," he said, echoing the serviceman without meaning to. "The ridge is patient. The cellar is patient. Your kind of patience is the only one that fails." He turned away and walked the track, shoulders straight, the paper perfect again in his hand, because he had decided it had never been burned. I opened the truck door, slid in, and turned the key. The engine coughed like a smoker, deciding whether to be brave. Then it caught and settled into the low argument all old engines have with winter. I let it warm and watched the ring through the windshield as if it might take offense that a machine disliked by mountains had decided to be loyal to me anyway. Go down, Calder said through the open window. "Don't stop at the store. Keep going. If you get to the turn with the split birch, take the left even though the right looks better. If there's fog, use the ditch as your compass. Don't look up the ridge. Don't look in the mirror if anyone says your name. If the phone rings again at 2017 while you're moving, let it ring and don't count the rings because counting is its own trap." "What about you?" I asked. I felt childish immediately. He smiled, not kindly, not unkindly. "I work here," he said. "Stop by for coffee when the weather isn't making jokes." The man in the green jacket leaned in the truck's far mirror. He shook his head once, slow. "We'll go with you," he said. "Sometimes we do. Sometimes we don't." He looked toward the ridge. "They'll travel in the ditch. Don't give them your number. My number. Your count," he said. "That's what names are. That's what years are. That's what debts become." I put the truck in gear and eased forward. The tires found the gap in the ring like a locked door finds a key it doesn't like but is obliged to respect. The truck slid through, the bed bumping once as if crossing a cattle guard. I watched the rear view and saw the circle close, like a wound deciding not to scar. The woman in blue stood outside of it and watched me leave with a look that did not accuse and did not forgive. She lowered her cupped hands, as if setting down a weight I had never offered to take. The track down had not changed. It felt different. Snow had drifted deeper in the places where it always drifts. The ruts were honest. The hood shook and the windshield wipers performed their small heroics. I kept the speed just under what fear would recommend. The county road appeared like a road pretending to be a creek, and then remembered it was a road when my tires insisted. I took the left at the split birch even though the right had been plowed by something with a better budget than me. The ditch carried a thin trickle of water under its crust. In it, something moved with the pace of conversation not meant for me. The ridge on my right kept its height. The sky bleached and then hardened back to blue, the kind that holds a moon even in daylight. I didn't look for it. Snow sifted from the firs when wind told them to. The engine warmed another degree and did not quit. The phone sat dead on the passenger seat, obedient as a dog told to stay. Past the old gate where the chain always looks new no matter the year, a fog made of nothing rose from the ditch, unrolled itself across the road, and asked me a riddle by existing. I kept the left tire in the shallow trench the county had cut a decade ago. The truck drifted once and I corrected slow and did not tap the brake. Someone said my name. Not the phone. Not the radio. The ditch. It said it softly, the way a person says your name in a stairwell when they're not sure whether to call to you or keep their dignity. I set my jaw the way my mother used to when a bill came due and we had more month than money, and looked at the hood ornament instead of at anything with a face. Past the old mine turnoff, the fog thinned. The road remembered to be ugly. The truck liked that. The miles began to add up in a column the accountant in me approved of. The ridge sloped lower as the world opened wider, and the rules felt less like iron and more like etiquette. I dared the rear view and saw miles back, the man in white walking, the paper in his hand, not hurrying because nothing important to him ever has to. My phone blinked awake 1 bar, then 2, then none. It bled battery looking for a promise. I didn't call my mother because her voice would require me to say what I would do next, and I didn't know. The clock on the dash said 2009. 8 minutes. The number mattered to me the way a nail head matters. When you are counting in a room that would like you to fill the silence with integers, I turned the radio knob as if it were a person I could distract. Static. A country station from farther east complaining about a woman and a truck in the order that proves which one the singer loved more. I let it play low to make the air heavy with something human and foolish. At the bend where the road grows a scar from an old landslide, the world decided to change the rules without memo. The ditch deepened. The engine note shifted. The steering wheel softened under my hands. Any resistance gone, as if I were turning a knob that wasn't attached to a valve. The truck drifted left and came back right in a way no driver wants. I lifted my foot. The hood lunged a fraction. Snow sobbed under the tires and then screamed. The world tilted enough to make the coffee in my thermos remember it was a liquid. I was sliding. I didn't pump the brake. I didn't turn into the skid because there was no skid and no friction to speak of. The road and I had stopped being in agreement. The truck moved slow, too slow, as if that made it kinder, toward the berm and the ditch, and the drop beyond, shaped by a creek the county had never persuaded into a culvert. At the edge of the fog a shape paced me, pale, long, wrong, not deer, not elk, not any geometry I wanted to name. It kept even with my window, and I knew that if I looked full at it, I would have to count the parts of it, and then I would have given it what it wanted. There are moments where all the rules you have ever been given gather around you, and wait to see whether you'll invent a new one. I took my hands off the wheel. I took my foot off the pedal. I let the truck choose. It chose to slide true, nose forward, into the berm with a resistant sigh. The right wheels rode up. The left wheels dropped into the ditch. The bumper kissed a buried rock with a soft, expensive noise. We stopped halfway tilted. If I opened the door on the driver's side, I would step into the air and find the ground later. I turned the key. The engine did not die. The dash clock said 2017. The phone on the seat woke without a ring and said my name in my mother's voice. Then my uncle's. Then mine. Then a girl's I did not know and did not want to. The radio whistled twice and then held a note like a kettle that has boiled every morning for 100 years. Somewhere behind me, uphill, a voice I trusted never actually to arrive said, "Sign." And the syllable was the shape of a long, narrow door. I kept my mouth shut. I put the truck in neutral. I set the brake slow and then took it off slow. I reached across my own lap, unlocked the passenger door, and opened it onto a bank of packed snow high enough to be a step. I turned sideways and slid out and landed knee deep in something that had been powder yesterday and was now a persuasion. The thing pacing me in the fog did not cross the ditch. It is odd, the laws that bind some things and not others. I did not tell it that our ditch is a human lie pretending to be a river. I climbed the snowy bank and stood on the road with both boots making the same stubborn impression human boots have made on ridges since people decided not to stay where it was easy. I looked back down the grade. The ring around the cabin had been miles away, but something like it had been drawn here, too. Thin, irregular, traced by the ditch and the drift and decisions I was only now in the position to see. My truck settled. Metal ticked. Steam laced the cold air delicate as lace a grandmother keeps in a drawer for arguments about propriety. Daniel. Not a voice behind me. Not a voice in front. The voice came from the road itself, from the packed snow where boots had made history. It said my name once, and then added a number I have not told you, because I did not tell it to the voice, and because numbers can be given away same as names, and I have so few left that belong to me. I stepped back to the door and looked at the wheel and saw what I could do. It wasn't clever, and it wasn't safe, and it wasn't fair. I dug with my hands until my gloves went wet and then stiff. I packed snow under the tires. I found sticks and jammed them crosswise, little bridges for rubber to believe in. I took the rope from the cab and walked it up slope and found a stump that had learned how to be a stump before my grandfather was born, and tied the knot I'd tied to the cellar doors. I kept my mouth shut. I heard the phone speaking numbers I had not given to anyone I liked. I heard the radio breathe in the shape of a whistle and out in the shape of a promise. I climbed back across the seat and into the driver's position that would not do what driver's positions do. I put the truck in low. I did not floor it. I listened to the engine and coaxed it like a stubborn mule, and we moved an inch, two. The rope tightening and the stump accepting, and then the tire finding. We lurched and settled and lurched, and the right wheels came down, first one, then the other, and the truck stood square again in the road like a man relearning to stand after a winter of work he did not want. The clock said 2023. The phone was quiet. The fog had pulled back into the ditch like a scolded animal. The pale shape in the trees was not there, which is to say it had improved itself into invisibility. I did not say thank you to anything because gratitude is a contract I could not properly read. I drove slow, steady, hands light, a mile, then two. The county sign appeared with its bullet holes earnest as punctuation. Beyond it, the state trooper sat in his car with the heater on, writing something on a pad with the look of a man who enjoys bureaucracy as a sport. He didn't look up. The world had become ordinary where he was, and ordinary is the best lie a man in my position can hope for. I kept going. The valley opened. The ridge stepped back. The sky decided to be too blue and then got embarrassed and put down a cloud to make up for it. Town arrived with its necessary ugliness: dumpsters, propane tanks, an assemblage of pallets that has not moved in 3 years. I pulled into Calder's lot and parked crooked. I didn't turn off the engine. He came out with 2 mugs of coffee and handed me one through the window like communion. "Don't get comfortable," he said. "You'll need to go farther than this before it decides you've gone far enough." "Far enough for what?" I asked. "For it to let you be who you are without asking for the peace it thinks it's owed," he said. "And what about the cabin?" He regarded me as if I had asked whether the moon minds being looked at. "It's your uncle's as much as it's yours," he said. "Which is to say, it was never entirely either of yours." He took off his hat and rubbed the ridge of his forehead where the hat had been. "You fixed the number below. You set its ring back where it likes. You bought yourself a day, maybe 2. You can come back. Or you can sell it to someone you don't hate. Or you can keep making bargains until you're as tired as he was." "I'm not signing anything," I said, because saying it out loud made it easier to be the kind of person who keeps saying it when asked again by better suits. "You're not done counting," he said, because he is the kind of man who knows how to ruin any moment you believe to be conclusive. "You've still got to decide if you're going to keep the count the house likes, or teach it a new one and pay what that costs." The man in the green jacket stood across the street outside the diner, pretending to read a menu taped to the window. He didn't raise his head. He didn't need to. The ridge had sent him, or I had invented him, or both could be true. The phone on the seat vibrated once against the fabric. Not a ring, not a voice, just motion, like a heart skipping to remind you that it intends to be in charge of you a while yet. I could have turned off the engine then and there. I could have gone inside and ordered eggs, and let the normal salt in the normal shaker remind me how cheap a miracle can be when it's mined by the ton and shipped by men with overtime. I could have asked Calder what it cost him to become the sort of person who knows exactly how much help to give and exactly when to stop. Instead, I put the truck in gear, lifted a hand at him that was wave and salute and admission, and I drove on. Because quitting at town is a different kind of signature, and I don't like to sign things I don't read. Past the last mailbox, before the county line, a woman in a blue dress stood by the culvert, where spring always wins the quiet argument with frost. She didn't look at me. She looked at my right hand on the wheel. She held out her cupped hands and didn't ask and didn't need to. I kept both hands where they were. I pointed with my chin at the ditch. She followed the gesture with her eyes, and then set her hands down at her sides, like a person who has refused a kindness and is proud of the refusal. At the sign that tells you what county you're leaving and what county you're entering, the phone spoke one word. Not my name. Not a number. It said, softly, the way a sick man speaks into a pillow to avoid frightening his nurse. Tonight. Not tonight. I told it, and my voice surprised me by not breaking. The road stretched, the sky widened, and the truck behaved like an animal that has survived a bad winter and intends to live into another. I did not look in the mirror. I did not look at the ridge. I looked at the scratch my uncle had put in the dashboard with a ring he wore when he forgot to take it off to work, and I let it be my star. The county line sign slid behind me. A rust-bitten rectangle that should have felt like freedom, but instead sat in the rear view like a silent witness. My uncle's voice, or the echo that wanted to be his, had told me, tonight, and I had answered, not tonight. It should have ended there, but rules don't quit. They bend, they stretch, they wait for you to use the wrong tense. The road ran straight as string pulled too tight, fields of frozen grass lifting in little gusts, fences gone slack under the weight of weather. The truck hummed steady, wheels chewing distance, heater fighting to turn the cab into a room worth trusting. I kept my eyes on the horizon because horizons never lie, they only refuse to tell you what's on them. For half an hour I saw no one, no cars, no deer, no birds in the winter trees. Solitude has a flavor. This was the flavor of paper left in a drawer too long, stale, brittle, ready to crumble if touched. At the next junction I slowed. A crossroads, the kind where county roads meet but never agree on who has the right of way. The stop sign wore 3 bullet holes like medals. On the far side of the crossing stood a man in a pale shirt and dark tie, exactly as before, but without the paper this time. His hands were in his pockets, his hair neat as if he had combed it with someone else's mirror. He didn't move toward me. He just tilted his head, listening for something only he could hear. Then he turned and walked into the corn stubble, vanishing like an actor who knew his cue had been called somewhere else. I didn't chase him with my eyes. I pushed the truck into gear and rolled through the intersection, tires humming their vote. But the silence in the cab thickened. I glanced at the phone on the seat. Dark screen, dead battery, no life in it, but the thing had spoken without power before. My throat dried. I reached for the radio knob and found static. I spun the dial slow, careful. At 87.9 a voice, faint but clean 37. Then gone. My fingers froze on the knob. 37. The nails, the count, the number that had kept me alive. Hearing it in a stranger's voice made the cab feel crowded. I shut the radio off and drove with both hands tight on the wheel. By dusk the fields thinned into town edges. Grain silos, shuttered motels, the gas station with the lone pump that pretends its credit card reader still works. I pulled in under the buzzing sodium lamp. The pump screen glowed faint green. I slid my card. The machine spat it back. I tried again. Same result. The digital display blinked once, then printed words across it that no gas pump has any reason to print QNT. I pulled the nozzle free anyway, pressed the trigger. Gasoline flowed, a living smell in the cold. The meter ticked normal numbers, polite digits, gallons and cents. But above the total, faint, like something written under the paint 35, 36, 37. The numbers rose and fell without pattern, like a gambler's hand. Not yours, I muttered, and clicked the pump shut. The smell followed me into the cab, clinging. I drove again. Town proper came and went: a bank, a diner, a pawn shop. The ordinary ugliness of a place that never pretends to be anything else. I should have felt safe. I should have stopped, bought supplies, asked questions. But something in me knew the rules hadn't loosened. They had lengthened. The ridge might be behind me, but rules travel better than people do. Past midnight, I reached a motel out on the state highway, one of those one-story strips where the sign always hums the wrong letters. I pulled in because fatigue is a predator. The cab had grown too small, the night too large. The clerk behind the desk was a thin woman with hair dyed the yellow of last year's wheat. She smiled, polite but tired. "Room for one?" "Yes." My voice cracked from Dessous. I filled the register line with Daniel M., no last name. The pen's ink flowed reluctantly, as though it wanted to keep my letters for itself. She slid me the key, brass, real weight, attached to a fob with the number 37 stamped into it. My hand clenched. I almost gave it back. But fatigue makes bargains for you. I carried the key to room 37 and opened the door. The room smelled of disinfectant and old television, a bedspread patterned with geometric shapes, a dresser, a bolted-down TV. Ordinary, blessedly ordinary. I sat on the bed, boots still on, and listened. The phone rang at 2:17. Not the motel phone. My phone, the dead one, lying face down on the dresser. The screen lit with a cold glow. I picked it up and pressed it to my ear, slow, as if lifting a snake by the tail. "Tonight?" the voice said again. Not my uncle. Not me. Not any voice I had known. It was flat, bureaucratic, without accent. "Tonight the count changes." I swallowed. My mouth was dry as chalk. "No," I whispered. "Not tonight." The voice paused. Then tomorrow." The line went dead. The screen blacked out. I sat on the bed with the key fob cold in my palm, the number etched deeper than brass should allow, and knew with a certainty sharper than fear. I had left the cabin, but the rules had packed themselves into my pockets. Outside, in the parking lot, something moved past my window, slow, deliberate, pale. The glass rattled once, as though tapped by 3 wide fingers, and then it was quiet again. The motel room settled around me the way a jacket does after you convince yourself it fits. The bedspread rasped under my palms, polyester fibers arranging themselves into a small geography of triangles and squares. 3 taps on the window, widely spaced, patient, had rattled the glass and then stopped. The air went patient in response. The heater cycled and could not decide whether it believed in warmth. I stood and peered through the slit in the curtain. The parking lot lay under the orange dome of the sodium lamp like a coin under cheap glass. Snow along the curb had crusted over. Footprints from earlier guests had been smoothed by wind into uncertain ovals. No pale shape, no man in a white shirt, no woman in blue with cupped hands. Just the cold insisting on its job. The brass key fob dug into my palm. 37. The number had followed me in like a stray. I set the key on the dresser, screen side up beside my dead phone, and watched its reflection stutter in the black TV. The phone should have been a rectangle of failure. Instead, it was a closed eye waiting for the hour it liked. The motel had a notepad by the phone, the kind with the property's name in curly letters, and a picture of a pine that has never existed. I pulled the paper free and a pen from the cup. The rules had traveled, whether I had wanted them to or not. So I started writing, because writing is how you announce to yourself that you haven't been collected yet. Do not open the door when the glass is tapped 3 times after midnight, even if you recognize the knock. Do not say your name to anyone who uses your middle initial in a sentence. At 20:17 a.m., the phone will try to make a decision for you. Let it make its decision alone. If a number appears where numbers don't belong, you are being asked to keep count for something that feeds on counting. Decline. The pen wrote slower as if the ink had thickened. like blood that has cooled and will move but wants to be asked. I wrote one more, I will only obey rules that keep me human. The heater sighed at that, as if relieved to hear someone say it out loud. I lay down without undressing and kept my boots on, because boots know what to do when a floor changes its mind. The bed gave in the middle and made a small bowl of me. I let my body pretend to sleep while my mind waited for the color to drain out of the clock. At 217, the phone did not ring. It breathed. The screen brightened with a thin, coffin blue light. I picked it up and pressed it to my ear, because I had learned that ignoring such invitations gives them a reason to invent courtesies I cannot refuse. "Tonight," the voice said, flat, without music, without gender. "Tonight the count changes." I could taste the motel water in the air. "Not tonight," I told it, not loud, as if arguing downstairs with a neighbor about a misdelivered package. Silence. Then a click far away, the kind elevators used to make when floors were chosen by a man in a uniform. "Tomorrow," the voice said, and didn't wait for me to decline a second time. I set the phone back down. The lamp on the nightstand flickered once and then steadied. On the dresser, the brass fob held its number like a coin faces heads down. I turned the key over. 37 looked up at me from an indentation worn smooth by other hands. In that moment, I knew with an ordinary clarity I was not going to be allowed to solve this at a motel on the highway. The thing I had left would keep following until it had been told, clearly, without ceremony, what it was allowed to own. I stayed until dawn, because leaving in the dark makes even the correct decision feel like panic. When the light finally arrived, a small, gray flavor of it, I checked out. The clerk slid the receipt toward me without eye contact. "How was your stay?" she asked. "I slept," I said, which was the politest and truest thing available. On the highway, the sky came apart and remembered blue. I drove with coffee cooling between my knees and the heater at my shins, and the dashboard scratch my uncle had left the year he forgot his ring on. Town fell behind. Past the grain silos and the pawn shop, past the plastic banner the church had left up too long, the verse ghosted by the winter sun. At the county line, the sign had collected more bullet holes in the hours since I'd passed it going the other way. I slowed. The ditch ran black with water that had refused to freeze to anyone else's schedule. In that water, just at the culvert's mouth, a color deepened. A dress, blue that belonged to no cloud. She stood there a moment later, as if the ditch had prepared the figure, and then decided to present it cleanly, hands cupped, eyes lowered, a distance I thought I knew. I pulled to the gravel shoulder and killed the engine, and sat with my hands visible on the wheel like a man introducing himself to a lingering cop. The window made a small scratch sound as I lowered it 2 inches. Cold came in like a thin, disciplined animal. She raised her head, not all the way. Her face was the kind that becomes the face you picture when you say woman, not because it is ordinary, but because it contains so many stories that ordinary starts to look like you've trusted a census too much. "Please," she said. I pointed to the culvert. The water had taken on a greedy shine. She looked at it and did not step in. "From your hand," she said, and the words rasped the way creek stones do, when they've learned to speak human sounds out of stubbornness, not talent. At the cabin, the rule had been simple: point, and she won't step. I had obeyed. I had slept and not well, and yet I had continued. Here, away from those logs, away from that table, the rule felt like a direction that belonged to a house, not to me. I took a breath so I'd be sure not to be impulsive. I poured water from my thermos into the motel room's plastic cup, because nothing else had the indecency to be a chalice, and I set the cup on the gravel at the edge of the black flow. "From my hand is not on offer," I said. "From the earth is." I did not say I was sorry. I do not know if I was. She watched the cup as a cat watches an open door. "Thank you," she said without moving, and then she was a seam in the air again, stitched shut by a cold hand I could not see. The water in the cup iced at the edge, and then cracked down the middle in a line exactly like a mirror's shout. I started the truck, and the sound of the engine was as ridiculous and as moving as music in a waiting room. Past the split birch, the road narrowed into its own argument. Halfway up the grade, where the county quits pretending to maintain, fog unrolled like cloth from the ditch, trying to be theater. I kept the left tire close to the trench's edge and remembered Calder's advice like scripture. The phone on the seat stayed dark. The radio kept quiet. Somewhere in the trees, something with the wrong number of joints paced me and did not push. By the time the track to the cabin showed itself, the day had tightened like a drumhead. The ruts remembered me immediately. Snow threw itself against the fenders with small, throated sighs. The ridge, not a thing, not a place, but a law pretending to be geography, squatted with humoring patience beyond the yard. The circle in the snow was back. Not as deep, not as confident, but redrawn. It had not expected me to leave and, having been outmaneuvered, had sulked a child's sulk and worked harder in the night. I rolled the truck to a stop where the track ended and listened to my engine cool in small ticks. Beyond the circle, in his purposeful place among the uphill firs, the man in the green jacket stood with his hands behind his back, the way guardians and criminals stand when they mean to be seen and to deny they are performing. "You came back," he said, as if reading a weather report. "I brought your rules," I said, and held up the notepad page I'd folded and carried in my pocket like a passport. "And mine," he considered that. "You'll keep some?" he said. "You'll ruin others. Ruin is a kind of progress. Ruin is your word," I said. "Mine is eat it." "Eat it is a way to forgive yourself," he said. "I prefer it." The woman in blue was not in the yard. The creek hissed under its skin of ice. The cellar doors sat where they always had, iron latch like a throat waiting for a swallow. I unloaded what I had, the coil of rope, the lantern, an old coffee can filled 2/3 with iron filings I'd finished, making at the motel parking lot, with the file I'd stolen from my uncle's tin, and a willingness to look ridiculous in public. The filings had weight enough to be honest. Inside, the air smelled of ash and pine, and something that had nothing to do with fuel or lumber. I went first to the bathroom. The mirror had given itself a single crack, an elegant line from upper left to lower right like a sentence that had decided to stop in the middle. I faced it to the wall again and covered it with the cloth, centered the triangle of glass on top, and pressed my palm flat until I felt the quiet take. At the table, I set the notepad page down and spoke what I had written, not because the house required sound, but because I did. I will not open when the glass is tapped 3 times after midnight, even if I know the knocker. I will not say my name to anything that tries to make numbers out of me. At 2017, I will not greet. I will not count for someone else's hunger. I will obey only the rules that keep me human. The cabin registered the words not with a wind or a groan, but with a slight change in how it carried its weight. Houses have postures just like bodies do. This one shifted from a watchman's lean to a man at a desk, listening for his name at roll call. I went to the door and laid the iron filings across the threshold thickly, a gray-black draft that made the nose remember pennies. I tapped iron nails into the jamb again. 3 on the left, 3 on the right. I looked up and counted the nails above the door, and then stopped counting on purpose, exactly in the middle of a number that would have had a 7 in it. Numbers are a way to be enticed. I closed my mouth on arithmetic. Down the stairs to the cellar, with the rope around my waist, and tied at the foot of the iron bed upstairs, the way I had learned. The knot that had kept boats honest. The knot I had tied without speaking. The lantern's circle moved with me. The ring below was as I had left it, 2 iron hoops nested. 7 nails with their heads, stamped with the X my uncle had judged sufficient. In the tamped earth within the circle, a slight dome had risen in my absence, the size and dignity of a man's chest under a plain shirt. A long, slow exhale lifted the dust at its apex and laid it down again without moving air. "I'm not here to open," I said, addressing the floor, which felt absurd, though less absurd than pretending this was only dirt. "I'm here to close what I can close." It tried my name then, not as greeting. As a measurement, it spoke syllables that don't exist in English, a grammar of weight and water, and fitted my name into that grammar as a test. I kept my mouth shut. The rope at my waist tightened once, twice, like a mother's hand closing at the curb. I took 1 nail out, not at random, the one directly under where the stove sat. The lantern flame bent toward the gap, the way a flower will bend toward the window. The exhale quickened as if I'd startled a larger animal into remembering it could run. I set the nail at my feet and then pressed it back into the hole. The air settled. I needed to know precisely which part was imitate and which was command. At the stairs, the phone upstairs spoke in the perfect tone of a woman telling you you've waited long enough for a service that will not come. "Sign," it said. "Sign and we will count what we owe and what you do." Then, softly, an addendum in my uncle's voice. "Danny, it's easier." The cellar laughed that glass water laugh, pretending to be human, and the rope tightened into the notch of my hip hard enough to make me hiss and keep me where I was. I went up and closed the latch and tied it with the rope around the handles, double. I sat with my back against the doors and put the notepad page on my knees and read it again, not because it would help the house, but because it would help me when the time came to not reach for the latch. Dusk came early, uphill and fast. I cooked beans and ate standing. I banked the stove at 11:58 because obeying an honest order becomes easier the more you link it to your hands. I laid iron filings with a teaspoon as if they were spice any recipe would be grateful for. I checked the nails above the door and felt a child's urge to count and a grown man's competence at refusing. At 20:17 exactly, the phone did not ring. It did speak. It spoke in my voice first, then in my mother's, then in a voice I haven't had the courage to admit I recognized, a name I'd said once in college like a promise and never allowed to be a fact again. The voices asked, urged, explained, negotiated, normalized. The house listened. The ridge leaned forward until its shadow filled the yard. The man in the green jacket stood just beyond the edge of where our rules could be made and watched without blinking. "Tonight the count changes," the clean voice said at last, the one that had spoken to me at the motel. "It will be 38. 38. Not a prime. Not ours. Not his. A number that tells you it contains others, the way a debt does." I stood and went to the door and placed my palm flat to feel the woods listening. The nails above my hand didn't vibrate. They held sleet like silence. I said very calmly, "The count is not yours." Under the floor the exhale turned into a long inhalation, the kind that precedes a note the singer will hold too long. The iron ring below warmed by a sensation that had nothing to do with my lantern. The filings at my feet darkened at their edges and then cooled again. Each nail head above the door pushed up a fraction, so small that a carpenter would have had to run his fingers across them to suspect, so large that a house knows exactly what is happening when one of its numbers is being negotiated. 38, the voice repeated. Not an offer, a pressure. 37 had been a covenant I inherited. 38 was a friendly vise. accept it, and I would belong to something that kept lists with columns for subtraction. Refuse, and I would spend nights measuring iron with my tongue. I went to the table. I took out the deed. I unfolded it and laid it flat and looked at the date of recording and the tiny embossed seal that makes men feel old as soon as they see it. The white shirt man had walked roads and ditches to get me to sign a different sort of paper. I took a pen and I wrote across the blank back of the deed slowly, in the same block letters my uncle had used when telling a future version of me how not to die. This place holds to 37 until my hand leaves it. After that, it owes no number to anyone. I don't know where I learned to write that kind of sentence. Maybe all contracts pretend to be about land when they are about breath. I folded the deed and set it back inside its legal envelope and set my hand on it like a Bible at a swearing-in. 38. The voice said again, in a tone I can only describe as courteous irritation. 37 while I am here, I said. After I leave, you will use the numbers you used before he taught you a taste for ours. You would think a ridge could not consider. You would be wrong. The pause that followed was not about preparation. It was about posture. It was about whether to allow a man too small for the map to sound as if he mattered. Below, the earth sighed and the dome flattened. Above, one bright nail head seated itself with the tiniest click, an insect sound, an alphabet for iron. The others followed, not in parade. 37 is not a parade number, but in acceptance. The filings did not smoke. The glass did not crack. The phone said nothing under its breath. The heater breathed out a low animal approval that made me want to pat the stove the way men pat old dogs for jobs well done. The man in the green jacket bent his head, once, in acknowledgement, so spare it made my eyes sting. The woman in blue stood at the creek and lifted her hands to her mouth and lowered them again, as if she'd drunk and decided against letting me witness it. I slept then, because winning is a smaller god than endurance, and men who cling to it tend to break where they can be heard. When I woke, I made coffee and opened the cellar just long enough to look down at the ring and the nails and the tamped earth's surface smooth back to disciplined calm. I shut the doors without being asked to and set the latch. I tied the rope out of habit. I swept the filings back into their jar slow, like a man unspooling a story he means to retell. I counted the nails above the door once, and then I did not count them again in case the habit made me foolish. By noon, Calder's truck nosed up the track and stopped shy of the circle that had grown very faint, as if weather had organized a small rebellion. He climbed down with a thermos and 2 mugs and a tin of salt that, when I lifted its lid, had the correct weight and the honest shine, and did not turn black in the air. You edited, he said, after I told him what I had said at the table. I put a ceiling on a debt, I said, because saying it that way made me feel less like a man who has committed a heresy and more like one who has paid attention during tax season. He poured coffee and didn't look at the ridge. It will hold, he said, while you're here. I know, I said. You going to keep it? He asked. Shaben, place. Job. Until summer, I said. The words arranged themselves without asking permission. Until the creek goes clear. Until the last snow under the firs gives up. Until I can sit on the steps halfway through a morning and not listen for the phone to decide what it is. You'll write your own rules, he asked, the corner of his mouth moving the way laughter would if it wore a heavy coat. I already started, I said, and slid the motel notepaper across the table. He read and nodded, not like a teacher, but like a man who knows how to measure effort by the size of a person's print. If the thing in the white shirt comes back, he said, filling our cups again. I won't sign, I said. If the lady asks for water, he said, tipping the tin of salt toward the threshold line. I'll point, I said. Or, I'll set the cup on the ground where the earth can decide who gets what. If the nails misbehave on a Thursday, he asked, and his eyes flicked up at the lintel where the heads sat plain and round. I'll put them back where 7 makes sense, I said. And then I'll sit on the steps until I stop feeling clever. He put the tin away and clapped his hands once, a weather of his own. You talk like a man who has had a conversation with a river and accepted that the river got the last word, he said. Rivers don't sign anything, I said. Exactly, he said. When he left, the yard looked wider. The ring had fallen apart and joined the rest of the snow in being subject to wind, sun, and careless boots. The man in the green jacket moved less often, and when he did move, he did not try to be seen doing it. The woman in blue came each thaw, night, and stood farther off, and when I pointed, she nodded at once and did not bother pretending the ditch water was beneath her. The white shirt man with the paper walked by the track twice in the next month. Each time he moved as if he had found himself at the wrong gate and would never admit it to his employer. I kept the stove bank the way the rule liked. I played the radio's left, right, left game, and it respected me enough to stop breathing on my neck. The phone spoke at 2017 only 3 times more, each time not a command but a reminder that patience and hunger honor the same calendar. The last time, after it said my name once, it said, "Enough," I said. "Yes." And then it stayed silent, because some agreements are not documents. They're two people deciding in the same second to stop arguing. In the mornings, I swept the threshold and counted 7, and counted the miles between us and town, and learned them by the shape of the truck's rattle. I mended the parka properly and wore it when the moon grew thoughtless. I hung the mirror back only in daylight and uncovered it only when I had just washed my face and could stand to look at myself as the kind of man who writes and refuses and ties and sleeps. When the creek shed its lid and ran dark and slick with the business of spring, I sat on the steps and read the deed with the sentence I had written. I did not feel grand, I felt precise. The ridge listened the way an old animal does when you tell it you will be gone for a while and the pasture is still good, and you will come back, if you are the sort of person who can. On the day I left, I swept the filings into their jar and screwed the lid on tight. I counted 7 once and said the number out loud and said nothing else to anything that might use my voice against me. I covered the mirror and left the triangle of glass on it like a coin on a closed eye, knowing the old stories are all wrong and exactly right. I put the rules, my uncle's and mine, into the envelope with the deed and set them in the drawer where other men had kept other sentences and thought they were done. At the table I left a page beneath the salt jar. It said, "If you are here because you love the person who wrote these, obey the parts that keep you from being cruel to yourself. If the number above the door ceases to be 7, set it right. If the house asks you to count for it so it can grow stronger, decline. Do not open the cellar to show the ridge your courage. Courage isn't a door. It's a chair you sit in until the hour passes. If you hear anyone you love ask you to do anything at 217 in the morning, let them do the asking by themselves." I locked the door, then unlocked it, then locked it again. Because leaving is an act you have to teach your hands how to do successfully. In the yard, at the edge of what had once been a perfect circle, the man in the green jacket stood with his hands in his pockets, very human for once. He nodded when I nodded. "We will keep count," he said. "You will keep yours," I said. "We will keep ours," he agreed. "While you are away, the place will revert to the number it had before you knew any of this. While you are here, It will agree to your 30. 7 because you are stubborn and we are curious. That's the only bargain I came to make, I said. He smiled like a tree would if it were the sort of thing that smiled. We liked your uncle's stubbornness, he said. We like yours better. By the creek, the woman in blue lifted her hands one last time, not in asking, but in a gesture so old it made my ribs ache. Blessing or farewell. They are the same hand turned different directions. I pointed toward the water, and she laughed once, a sound that shaved the ice thinner in a single, needle, fine line. The truck started. The tires found their argument with the road and took it politely. The ridge stayed large and then, as it must, became a story told by the mirror. At the county line, nobody had shot the sign overnight. The phone on the seat stayed quiet. The radio found a station in which a man agreed to let his woman and his truck leave him on the same day and still sounded proud about something I couldn't name. In town, Calder poured coffee into a paper cup and told me that flour goes on sale when the river drops. We'll keep an eye, he said. Don't get clever about being safe. I won't, I said. I will get stubborn about being human. That's the same calendar with better printing, he said, and handed me a bag with nails I didn't need, and a tin of salt I might, and a new comb with even teeth. I drove until the sky decided to be completely elsewhere. At a motel off the state highway, a clerk slid me a brass key stamped with the number 14, and I slept without arguing with clocks. In the morning, the phone stayed a quiet square. On the windowsill, a cup of water I'd left out on purpose had iced in a pattern that looked nothing like a mirror, and exactly like sunlight on a riverbed. When I went back in summer, the creek was honest, and the ridge had returned to being a law I could live with. The nails above the door were 37. I counted once. Then I went for a walk without looking at the ridge, because I didn't have to prove I could anymore, and because counting the steps down to the water would only turn me into a kind of ledger. I have paperwork enough without letting the mountain write me down. I still hear the phone at 2017 sometimes, and sometimes it says my name exactly right. I let it talk to itself and I go on breathing. If you come to the place and read the rules, you'll see mine are shorter. They boil down to this: don't help the dark learn your habits. Don't trade your name for a number. Don't open the door to be brave. Do what keeps you human. The rest is weather, and even weather can be taught which chairs are not for it.